crystal glass had shattered across the marble.
Everyone stop. Look what she did.
Let me help you with that. It was me, but I can't lose this job.
Victor Langford did not wait for the
Do
truth.
not stand there like you belong here. Get on your knees, pick up every piece, and remember your place. And remember why people like you belong beneath people like me. People like you should be grateful we let you stand near us.
So he turned one accident into a public punishment.
This is what happens when staff forget they are replaceable.
Eleanor lowered herself beside the glass without begging.
Take her out through the service entrance.
In a way Victor did not understand.
One day, this room will remember exactly what you did.
Then Eleanor lifted the tray of broken glass, looked at Victor, and left through the service door with quiet dignity. And to understand why that moment would one day shake an empire, we have to go back. Nobody noticed the old woman until the glass shattered. For almost 3 hours, she had moved through the golden ballroom like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. She wore a simple black uniform, the kind of uniform people looked through rather than looked at. Her silver hair was tied neatly at the back of her neck. Her hands were thin but steady, and her eyes carried the quiet patience of someone who had survived too much to be easily frightened. To the guests, she was just another elderly cleaner working late at a charity gala where one table centerpiece cost more than a month of her wages. To the executives, she was part of the background, useful only because the marble floors needed to shine beneath their expensive shoes. But when the crystal glass slipped from a young waitress's trembling hand and burst across the floor near the center table, every conversation stopped. Heads turned. Cameras lowered. The orchestra softened without being told. And in that brief, sharp silence, Victor Langford saw an opportunity. Victor was the kind of man who had learned to turn even accidents into performances. He was the newly appointed president of Langford Global, a company built on family legacy, public generosity, and private cruelty. On stage, he spoke about compassion. In boardrooms, he destroyed people for sport. That night, surrounded by donors, politicians, journalists, and wealthy families who admired him from a safe distance, Victor needed someone small to blame, someone powerless, someone who could absorb his anger and make him look strong. So he pointed at the old woman. He did not ask what had happened. He did not check whether anyone had been hurt. He simply made sure everyone in the ballroom understood that, in his eyes, the mistake belonged to her. He turned a broken glass into proof of laziness. He turned a frightened waitress into a witness. And he turned an elderly cleaner into a public lesson about what happened to people who forgot their place. At first, the guests only stared. Some looked embarrassed, but embarrassment is often where cowardice hides. A few lowered their eyes. Others pretended to study their drinks. Nobody wanted to defend a cleaner at a gala funded by the most powerful family in the city. Nobody wanted to offend Victor Langford, not while his signature could open doors, close contracts, fund campaigns, and ruin careers. The old woman knelt slowly to gather the glass. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not tell them that her name was Eleanor Hayes, or that long before Victor ever wore his first tailored suit. She had walked through the original Langford office when it had only 6 desks, 2 telephones, and a leaking roof. She did not tell them that she remembered Victor's grandfather before the city called him a visionary. She did not tell them that the marble beneath their feet had been purchased with sacrifices the Langford family had spent decades trying to erase. She simply reached for the broken pieces, and that was when Victor stepped closer. To the room, his expression looked like discipline. To Eleanor, it looked like inheritance. She had seen that look before in men who believed money was not only power, but permission to insult, permission to humiliate, permission to rewrite history until the people who built the foundation were buried beneath it. He made certain that his words reached the nearest table, then the next one, then the journalist standing beneath the balcony. He spoke with that cold, polished disappointment powerful people use when they want cruelty to sound like standards. He wanted the guests to believe the old woman had embarrassed the company. He wanted the donors to see him as a man who demanded excellence. He wanted the staff to understand that one mistake could cost them their dignity, and Eleanor kept her head lowered, not because she was ashamed, but because she was watching the reflection in the glass. In the broken pieces scattered across the marble, she saw the chandelier above her, the guests around her, Victor's polished shoes inches from her hand, and behind him, near the entrance, a young woman who had gone completely still. Lily Langford, Victor's younger sister, stood half hidden beside a column, her face drained of color. She knew something the others did not. She knew that the old cleaner on her knees was not just a cleaner. She knew that her late grandmother had kept a photograph in a locked drawer. A photograph of a younger Eleanor standing beside the original Langford founders, her hand resting on the first company ledger. Lily had found that photograph when she was 17. By then, she had already learned that the Langford family did not tell stories exactly as they happened. They polished them. They trimmed them. They buried the parts that made powerful men look human and powerless. Women look important. Her grandmother had warned her never to ask about Eleanor Hayes in front of Victor, not because Eleanor had done something wrong, but because the truth had become dangerous inside their family. Now, years later, Lily watched her brother humiliate the one person their family should have honored. Eleanor lifted the last piece of glass from the floor and placed it carefully onto the tray. Her hand trembled only once, so slightly that most people missed it. But Lily saw, and for reasons she could not explain, that tiny tremor hurt more than Victor's words. It was the tremor of someone who had endured too many rooms where silence was safer than truth. Victor was not finished. Men like him rarely were. Public cruelty has a rhythm, and once the room allows the first insult, the second one comes easier. He ordered the event manager to remove Eleanor from the floor before she embarrassed the company again. He said it as if the company belonged entirely to him, as if every name on the walls, every donation plaque, every ribbon-cutting photograph had led inevitably to his authority. He wanted the old woman escorted out through the service entrance, away from the donors, away from the cameras, away from the polished story he was trying to sell. But Eleanor did not move immediately. For the first time that night, she looked up. There was nothing dramatic in her expression. No anger, no plea, no performance. Her eyes simply met Victor's. And for one brief second, his confidence faltered. He did not know why. He could not have explained it. The old woman was smaller than him, poorer than him, older than him, and publicly cornered by him. By every visible measure, he had already won. Yet there was something in her stillness that felt less like defeat and more like memory. Then she lowered her gaze again and allowed the event manager to guide her toward the back corridor. The gala resumed, but not completely. Music returned. Conversations restarted. Silverware touched porcelain. Yet something had shifted in the air. People laughed a little too loudly. The journalists whispered behind their hands. The young waitress cried silently near the kitchen doors. Lily remained beside the column, feeling the old photograph burning in her mind like evidence she had been too afraid to use. Victor returned to the stage 20 minutes later to deliver the speech he had prepared. He spoke about legacy, generosity, responsibility, and the future of Langford Global. He told the room that great companies were built by great families. He praised his grandfather's courage, his father's discipline, and his own vision for a new era. The audience applauded exactly when they were supposed to. But in the service corridor behind the ballroom, Eleanor sat alone on a wooden bench beneath a flickering light, holding a folded envelope that had been hidden inside the lining of her coat for 12 years. She had not come to the gala to cause trouble. In truth, she had almost not come at all. At 74, Eleanor had grown used to living quietly. Her small apartment overlooked an alley behind a bakery. Her mornings began with tea, medication, and the slow ache of joints that remembered too many years of labor. She had no children who visited, no husband waiting in a chair by the window, and no neighbors who knew much beyond her name. To most of the world, she was an old woman with little money and fewer reasons to hope. But that was only the surface. Buried beneath the quiet routines of Eleanor's life was a story the Langford family had stolen, reshaped, and locked away. It began 48 years earlier, before Langford Global was a global anything, before its name hung on hospitals and museums, before executives toasted themselves under chandeliers. Back then, it was a failing logistics company on the edge of bankruptcy, owned by two ambitious brothers who had charms, connections, and almost no idea how to keep the business alive. Eleanor had been 26 when she joined them as an administrative assistant. That was what her title said. In reality, she became the person who understood the accounts, negotiated with suppliers, calmed angry drivers, repaired broken schedules, and stayed long after midnight, building systems no one else had the patience to build. She was not invited into official photographs at first. She was not given credit in meetings. But the company ran because she made it run. Thomas Langford, Victor's grandfather, noticed. Unlike his brother, Thomas still had enough humility in those days to recognize genius when it sat across from him with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. He began asking Eleanor for advice before every major decision. She warned him which contracts would collapse, which clients were lying, which expansion plans were too risky, and which quiet opportunities could save them. Again and again, she was right. The company survived because of her. Then it grew because of her. And when the Langford brothers nearly lost everything during the fuel crisis that threatened to destroy their delivery network, it was Eleanor who designed the partnership model that became the foundation of their empire. She created the structure that allowed independent drivers to become regional operators. She found the loopholes that kept costs low without breaking the law. She wrote the first expansion plan by hand at a kitchen table, while Thomas Langford paced behind her, terrified and hopeful. For a while, Thomas promised her the world. He promised her a proper title. He promised her equity. He promised her that when Langford became successful, everyone would know what she had done. And unlike many promises made by ambitious men, his was not entirely empty. In 1981, behind closed doors and against his brother's objections, Thomas signed an agreement granting Eleanor 12% ownership in the company if her restructuring plan succeeded over the next 5 years. It succeeded in 3. By then, Langford had become profitable, respected, and hungry. The brothers were no longer desperate men trying to save a failing office. They were rising figures in a city that loved success more than truth. Thomas still meant to honor the agreement, but his brother did not. Neither did the family lawyers. They understood what 12% would mean once the company continued to grow. They understood that the woman they had treated as an assistant would become one of the most powerful owners in the business. And they understood, perhaps most importantly, that Eleanor had no family wealth, no social protection, and no one the city would believe over the Langfords. So they waited for weakness. They found it when Eleanor's younger brother fell ill. Medical bills swallowed her savings. Hospital corridors replaced office nights. Her attention split between the company she had helped build and the only family she had left. During that vulnerable season, documents disappeared. Meeting minutes changed. Her access was reduced in the name of restructuring. People who had once asked for her help began treating her as if she had overstepped. Thomas, under pressure from his brother and terrified of scandal, delayed the announcement he had promised. Delay became silence. Silence became betrayal. When Eleanor confronted them, they offered her a settlement so small it felt like an insult wearing legal language. She refused. A week later, she was accused of leaking confidential information to a competitor. There was no proof that would have held under honest scrutiny. But the Langfords did not need honest scrutiny. They needed enough suspicion to stain her name, enough paperwork to frighten future employers, enough whispers to make her disappear. Thomas never publicly defended her. That was the wound Eleanor carried longest. Not the lost money, not the stolen ownership, not even the years of poverty that followed. It was the memory of Thomas Langford standing in a hallway, unable to meet her eyes, while men in suits erased her from the company she had saved. He sent one letter afterward, just one, written in a hand she knew too well. In it, he admitted that what had happened was wrong. He admitted the ownership agreement was real. He admitted he had been a coward. And he promised that one day he would make it right. But Thomas died before he could. His letter remained with Eleanor, along with a copy of the original agreement and 3 pages from the first expansion ledger. For decades, those papers lived in a tin box beneath her bed. She did not use them because revenge had never been the shape of her soul. At first, she lacked money for a legal battle. Later, she lacked strength. And eventually, she told herself that some truths were too old to matter. Then Victor Langford became president. The first week after his appointment, he announced a redevelopment project that would demolish a block of old worker housing near the original Langford warehouse. The company presented it as progress: luxury apartments, green spaces, a memorial plaza dedicated to the Langford founders. But Eleanor knew that block. She had lived there once. So had drivers, clerks, widows, mechanics, and the families who kept the company alive in its earliest years. The Memorial Plaza would honor men who wore suits while erasing the people who carried boxes through winter rain. That was what brought Eleanor back. She applied for temporary cleaning work at the gala venue under a staffing agency, using the same quiet skills that had helped her survive invisibility for years. She did not intend to confront Victor in public. She intended to find Lily Langford, the one member of the family whose letters to the housing residents had sounded almost human. Eleanor had seen Lily's name on a small foundation notice promising relocation assistance. She had hoped the young woman might listen. She had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that some branch of the Langford tree had grown away from the rot. But before Eleanor could reach Lily, the glass shattered, and Victor showed her exactly how little had changed. In the corridor, the envelope rested in Eleanor's lap. Beyond the wall, applause rose from the ballroom as Victor finished his speech. Eleanor listened to it with a strange calm. There had been a time when applause for a Langford would have made her feel invisible. That night, it sounded different. It sounded fragile. It sounded like glass before the fall. The young waitress approached her first. Her name was Mara, though Eleanor had only learned it earlier that evening when the girl nervously introduced herself near the service table. Mara was 19, maybe 20, with the exhausted bravery of someone working 2 jobs and still apologizing for needing rest. She had been the one holding the glass. Victor knew that. The event manager knew that. Eleanor knew that. But Mara had frozen when Victor blamed the old woman, and fear had swallowed the truth before it could leave her mouth. Now Mara stood in the corridor with red eyes and shaking hands. She wanted to confess. She wanted to say she had dropped the glass, that Eleanor had only tried to help, that Victor had been cruel for no reason. But the apology came out broken, tangled with terror over losing her job, her rent, her scholarship application, the fragile little bridge she was trying to build out of poverty. Eleanor did not scold her. That was one of the reasons cruelty never understood her. It expected humiliation to reproduce itself. It expected the wounded to wound someone weaker. But Eleanor had spent too long being blamed for things she did not do to take satisfaction in blaming a frightened girl for being afraid. She comforted Mara in the only way she knew how, with steadiness rather than speeches. She made the girl understand that one moment of fear did not define a life. But the next choice often did. Mara cried harder then, because kindness can be more painful than anger when guilt is fresh. Before either of them could say more, Lily entered the corridor. She had left the ballroom quietly during the final applause, slipping away from the donors and board members who expected her to smile beside her brother. Lily had spent most of her life inside the polished cage of the Langford name. People assumed privilege made a person free. In Lily's case, it had made her watched. Every choice was measured against reputation. Every friendship was questioned. Every opinion that challenged the family line was treated as youthful weakness. Even after she was grown, she had never been as bold as she wanted to be. That was the truth she hated most about herself. When her grandmother died, Lily found the photograph of Eleanor, the old ledger copy, and a note written in trembling handwriting that warned her the family owed a debt it had never paid. She had tried asking her father about it once. His face hardened so quickly that the question died in the room. After that, Lily learned the family rule. Some doors stayed closed because too much money was stacked against them. But seeing Eleanor on her knees in the ballroom had broken something in her. Not dramatically, not all at once, more like a thread snapping inside a fabric already worn thin. In the corridor, Lily faced the old woman her family had erased, and shame made her look younger than her age. She did not know how to begin. No apology felt large enough. No explanation felt clean. She could not undo the gala. She could not undo the decades. She could not undo the fact that she had known enough to suspect the truth and still remained quiet. Eleanor studied her for a long moment. In Lily's face, she saw traces of Thomas Langford, especially around the eyes. That resemblance once would have hurt. Now it only reminded her that families were not curses unless people chose to obey them. Lily told her, indirectly and painfully, that she knew about the photograph. She knew there had been an agreement. She knew Eleanor's name had been removed from the official history. And she knew Victor's redevelopment project was going to destroy more than buildings. The words came out carefully, not as dialogue but as confession. Each truth carrying the weight of years spent pretending not to understand. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Then she asked Lily, not with bitterness, whether knowing had changed anything. That question settled over the corridor like smoke. Because knowing is easy compared to choosing. Plenty of people know when something is wrong. They know when a colleague is being humiliated, when a worker is being exploited, when a family story has been polished until it becomes a lie. They know. And then they continue living as if knowledge alone makes them innocent. Lily had done that for years. She had known enough to feel guilty, but not enough to risk comfort. Until tonight. Lily looked toward the ballroom doors, where her brother's voice carried faintly through the walls as he accepted congratulations. Then she looked at the envelope in Eleanor's lap. She had no legal training, no power over the board, and no certainty that anyone would believe them. But she did have access. She had archives Victor ignored, passwords he assumed she would never use, and a place on the Foundation Committee overseeing the redevelopment. More importantly, she had finally reached the point where silence felt more dangerous than truth. Eleanor did not hand over the envelope immediately. Trust, once betrayed, does not return just because the next generation asks politely. Eleanor had learned that documents could disappear, promises could soften, and sympathy could evaporate when money entered the room. She had not carried those papers for 12 years, just to place them into another Langford hand without proof of courage. So she gave Lily something else first. A name. Samuel Reed. At the sound of it, Lily went still. Samuel Reed was not famous. He was not on company plaques. He was not mentioned in official biographies. But deep in Langford Global's oldest accounting files, his name appeared as a junior legal clerk during the year Eleanor was forced out. He had witnessed the signing of the original ownership agreement. He had also notarized a duplicate copy. According to the family story, Samuel had left the city shortly afterward for personal reasons. According to Eleanor, he had been paid to leave. For years, Eleanor believed Samuel was dead. Then, 3 months earlier, a letter arrived at her apartment with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a storage receipt from an archive facility outside the city and 6 words typed on plain paper. He kept what they buried. No signature, no explanation. Only the receipt, Samuel Reed's initials, and a date that matched the week Eleanor had been accused and dismissed. That was why Eleanor had come to the gala with the envelope. Not because the papers inside were enough by themselves, but because they might lead to something that was, Lily understood at once. The old ownership agreement could be challenged as outdated, disputed, or incomplete. Thomas's apology letter could be dismissed as guilt without legal weight. But if Samuel Reed had preserved original documents, internal memos, or evidence of the false accusation used to remove Eleanor, the story would change. Not only for Eleanor, for the redevelopment project, for the board, for Victor, for the entire mythology of Langford Global. For the first time that night, fear crossed Lily's face for a reason Eleanor respected. Because the truth, if real, would not simply embarrass Victor. It could cost him everything. The corridor door opened before either woman could speak further. The event manager appeared, pale and stiff, with Victor behind him. Victor had noticed Lily's absence. He had noticed whispers among staff. And Victor, like all insecure men dressed as kings, hated conversations he did not control. He looked from Lily to Eleanor to Mara, and the softness he used for donors vanished. There, away from cameras, the polished president became what he truly was, a man furious that someone beneath him still had the nerve to exist after being dismissed. He ordered Mara back to work. He reminded the event manager who paid the venue's contract. Then he turned his attention to Eleanor. He wanted her removed from the building immediately. Not after the shift. Not after paperwork. Immediately. He spoke of trespassing, liability, incompetence, and reputation. Every word was chosen to make cruelty sound administrative. Lily tried to intervene, But Victor cut her down with the ease of long practice. He had spent years training her to doubt herself, to soften her objections, to let him speak first and last. In public, he called it protecting the family. In private, it was domination. That night, however, something had changed. Lily did not retreat as quickly as she once had. Victor saw that change, and his anger sharpened. He warned Eleanor that people like her often mistook proximity to wealth for importance. He wanted the old woman to understand that cleaning a ballroom did not give her the right to stand in one. He wanted Lily to understand that compassion for staff was one thing, but challenging him in front of them was another. Most of all, he wanted to crush whatever invisible thread had formed between them before it became strong enough to pull a secret into the light. Eleanor rose slowly from the bench. Age had taken speed from her, but not presence. She stood with the envelope in one hand and the kind of silence that made Victor talk more than he should. He threatened her with the staffing agency. He threatened her with security. He threatened to make sure no reputable venue hired her again. And with each threat, Lily's face changed, because she was beginning to understand that Victor's cruelty tonight was not an accident. It was his nature. The only difference was that tonight, the victim had a name connected to a buried crime. Eleanor did not reveal the envelope. Not yet. She only told Victor, in a calm, indirect way that chilled him more than anger would have, that men who built their confidence on locked rooms should be careful when old keys still existed. Victor laughed because he had to. In front of the event manager, in front of Lily, in front of the young waitress still trembling by the wall. He needed the sound of laughter to prove he was not afraid, but his eyes had changed. He had heard something in Eleanor's words, not enough to understand, enough to worry, and worry, in a man like Victor, always became punishment. By midnight, Eleanor had been dismissed from the temporary staff list. Mara had been warned that any further discussion of the glass incident would be treated as insubordination. The event manager had been pressured to sign a report, claiming Eleanor acted aggressively after being corrected. Lily was escorted back to the family car under the excuse that the night had been stressful, and Victor returned home convinced he had contained a small problem before it became visible. He was wrong. The next morning, the first video appeared online. It had been recorded by someone at a donor table near the center of the ballroom. The angle was unsteady. The audio was imperfect, but it showed enough. It showed Victor standing over an elderly cleaner. It showed the broken glass. It showed the room's silence. It showed the president of Langford Global speaking to a woman old enough to be his grandmother, as if dignity were something she had not earned. By noon, the clip had spread. By evening, the company's public relations team had written 3 different versions of regret, none of which admitted fault. Victor approved the coldest one. It described the incident as an unfortunate misunderstanding during a busy charity event. It praised the staff. It reaffirmed Langford Global's commitment to respect. It did not mention Eleanor by name. That omission was deliberate. Victor believed unnamed people faded faster, but Lily knew better now. Names were where buried stories began to breathe. That night, while Victor argued with advisors in the main house, and their father avoided involvement with the practiced helplessness of a retired patriarch, Lily entered the private archive beneath the old Langford estate. It was not a dramatic place, just a climate-controlled room with shelves of boxed records, framed awards, obsolete contracts, and family history arranged by people who believed organization was the same as honesty. Lily had been there many times as a child, usually during tours meant to teach her pride. Now she moved through it with a different feeling. Not pride. Not even rebellion. Something quieter and more dangerous. Responsibility. She searched for Samuel Reed first. The official employment record was thin. Too thin. A hire date. A department assignment. A resignation letter. And a forwarding address that led to a building demolished decades earlier. But behind that file, in a box labeled with early legal correspondence, Lily found something strange. A memo referencing duplicate equity instruments assigned for external safekeeping. The memo had been marked irrelevant by a family attorney who died before Lily was born. Duplicate equity instruments. External safekeeping. The words were dry, almost boring. But Lily felt her pulse change. Powerful families often buried their sins under language so dull that no one wanted to keep reading. She kept reading. 2 hours later, she found a ledger index listing restricted storage transfers in 1984. Most entries were coded. One line carried Samuel Reed's initials. Another carried the abbreviation E. Eleanor Hayes. Lily photographed the page with shaking hands. Then the archive door opened. For a moment, she thought it was Victor. Her body reacted before her mind did. Shoulders tightening, breath stopping. But it was not her brother. It was Mrs. Calloway, the estate housekeeper. A woman in her late 60s who had worked for the family since Lily was a child. Mrs. Calloway had the unnerving calm of someone who had spent decades hearing secrets through walls and pretending the silver needed polishing. She looked at the open boxes. She looked at Lily's phone. Then she closed the door behind her. Lily expected a warning. Instead, Mrs. Calloway told her that her grandmother had once asked the same questions. Not openly, never openly, but near the end of her life, when illness loosened the family's grip and regret began slipping through. Lily's grandmother had searched for a woman named Eleanor. She had believed Thomas Langford died with a debt on his conscience. She had believed the company's foundation was not clean. And she had left instructions with Mrs. Calloway in case Lily ever came looking. From a locked cabinet behind old linens, Mrs. Calloway retrieved a small envelope sealed with wax that had cracked from age. Inside was a key. Not a metaphorical key. Not a symbolic keepsake. But a real brass key attached to a paper tag bearing the name of an archive facility outside the city. The same facility from Eleanor's mysterious receipt. Lily stared at it, feeling the story rearrange itself around her. The past was no longer a rumor, no longer a photograph, no longer a guilt her family could wave away. It had a location. It had a key. It had been waiting. Mrs. Calloway did not ask Lily what she planned to do. Perhaps she already knew. Perhaps old houses teach certain women that justice rarely arrives through official channels. Before leaving, she only warned Lily that Victor had ordered the archive access logs reviewed after the gala. He was frightened, whether he admitted it or not. And frightened men with power did not merely defend themselves. They struck first. By morning, Victor did. Eleanor woke to pounding on her apartment door. The building hallway smelled of damp plaster and old cooking oil. Her kettle had just begun to whistle. She moved slowly, one hand against the wall, already sensing before she opened the door that the world outside had changed. 2 representatives from the staffing agency stood there, joined by a man in a gray coat who introduced himself as a legal consultant for the venue. Their faces held the stiff discomfort of people paid to deliver harm politely. They informed Eleanor that a formal complaint had been filed against her. She had allegedly behaved aggressively toward a company executive after causing disruption at a private event. She had allegedly refused instructions. She had allegedly made threatening remarks until the matter was reviewed. She would be removed from all agency assignments. The words fell into the apartment like old dust. Eleanor had heard versions of them before. Allegedly, disruption, threatening, review. Words that powerful people used when they wanted a lie to wear shoes and walk into official records. She did not argue at the doorway. She did not beg them to reconsider. She only asked for a copy of the complaint. The legal consultant hesitated, then provided a printed notice with Victor Langford's name buried beneath formal language. Eleanor accepted it with a politeness that made the young staffing representative look ashamed. After they left, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table and read the notice twice. Then she laughed once, softly and without humor. Victor had made the same mistake his grandfather's brother made decades earlier. He believed that if he accused her first, the world would stop listening. He believed that paperwork could turn cruelty into truth. He believed an old woman living alone would be too tired, too poor, and too afraid to fight. And maybe she had been, once. But age does strange things to fear. It weakens the body. Yes, but sometimes it also strips away the illusion that there is still too much to lose. Eleanor had lost her career, her reputation, her brother, her home, and half a lifetime of recognition. What remained was not weakness. It was clarity. She took the tin box from beneath her bed. Inside were the old papers, wrapped in cloth and handled with the reverence of scars. The agreement, Thomas's letter, the ledger pages, newspaper clippings from Langford's rise, a photograph of Eleanor at 26, standing in front of the original office with sleeves rolled to her elbows and exhaustion hidden behind a smile. She had not looked at that photograph in years. The young woman in it seemed almost like someone she had failed to protect. For a long time, Eleanor had believed justice meant returning to that young woman and giving her back what was stolen. Now she understood justice meant something larger. It meant stopping Victor before he erased another community, another worker, another inconvenient truth beneath the shine of a new memorial plaza. Her phone rang just before noon. It was Lily. Her voice carried the strain of someone who had not slept. But beneath it was resolve. She had found the archive key. She had found references to Samuel Reed. She believed the storage unit still existed. But Victor had begun watching her movements. If she went alone, he would know. If she used a company car, he would know. If she requested records formally, he would bury them before sunset. Eleanor listened, then looked toward the window where rain had begun tracing crooked lines down the glass. For 48 years, Langford men had traveled in private cars, while others walked through storms for them. The thought almost made her smile. She agreed to meet Lily near the old bus depot 2 miles from the archive facility. Not at the estate. Not at a company office. Not anywhere Victor controlled. At the bus depot, a place for people who still understood what it meant to carry their own bags. And by the time Eleanor buttoned her coat, placed the envelope inside, and stepped into the rain, the story Victor thought he had ended in a ballroom was already moving beyond his reach. The archive facility sat at the edge of the city, where warehouses replaced cafes and the sidewalks cracked beneath weeds. It was the kind of place wealthy families used precisely because no one would think to look for their secrets there. Rows of metal doors, fluorescent lights, security cameras with tired angles, a front office that smelled faintly of paper, dust, and burnt coffee. Lily arrived first in an old borrowed car that did not belong to the family. When Eleanor saw her, she noticed the change immediately. The young woman who had stood frozen beside the ballroom column was gone. In her place was someone frightened, but awake. That mattered. Courage was not the absence of fear. Eleanor had learned that long ago. Courage was what remained when fear stopped being the strongest voice in the room. The key worked. That was the first miracle. The storage unit resisted at first, the lock stiff from years of disuse. Then it opened with a metallic sound that seemed too small for the weight of what waited behind it. Inside were file boxes stacked along one wall, a rusted cabinet, and a wooden crate sealed with tape so old it had turned brittle. Dust rose when Lily lifted the first lid. Samuel Reed had kept everything. Not neatly, not completely, but enough. There were copied memos between Langford attorneys discussing how to neutralize Eleanor's ownership claim. There were handwritten notes from meetings where executives debated whether her restructuring plan could be separated from her name. There were early drafts of the false accusation that later destroyed her reputation. There were internal calculations estimating the future value of the 12% stake they refused to honor. And at the bottom of the second box, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, was a notarized duplicate of the original agreement. Eleanor did not touch it at first. She only stared. Some moments do not arrive with thunder. Some arrive quietly. So quietly the heart does not know whether to break or heal. For nearly half a century, Eleanor had carried the truth inside her body like an old injury. She knew what had happened. Thomas knew. The men who betrayed her knew. But knowing without proof had made her memory feel like a locked room no one else could enter. Now the room was open. Lily began crying before Eleanor did. That was the strange thing. The young Langford cried first, not from guilt alone, but from the shock of seeing the family myth collapse in paper form. Wealth had taught her that history was something displayed in frames. These boxes taught her that history was also something hidden in storage units by frightened clerks who could not stop a crime but could refuse to let it vanish. Samuel Reed had left a statement too. It was dated 21 years earlier, written after he learned he was ill. In it, he confessed that he had been pressured to help bury Eleanor's ownership agreement. He described the payments, the threats, the altered records, and the false leak accusation created to justify her dismissal. He admitted his own cowardice without trying to decorate it. And near the end, he wrote that if the documents were ever found, they should be given to Eleanor Hayes first, because no court and no company had the right to hear the truth before the woman who paid for its silence. Eleanor sat on an overturned crate and covered her mouth. For decades, she had imagined proof would make her feel triumphant. Instead, it made her feel tired. Tired for the young woman who had fought alone. Tired for the brother who died while she was buried under legal threats. Tired for every job interview that ended strangely after someone made a call. Tired for the birthdays spent calculating rent. Tired for the years in which the world praised Langford generosity while she clipped coupons beneath a leaking ceiling. But beneath the tiredness, something else stirred. Not revenge. Return. The truth was returning to its owner. Lily photographed every document. Eleanor insisted on taking the originals only after they documented the unit exactly as they found it. That surprised Lily, but it should not have. Eleanor had built systems before Lily was born. She knew evidence needed order. She knew powerful people would attack the process before they addressed the facts. She knew Victor would call the documents forged, stolen, misinterpreted, anything but true. So they worked carefully, methodically, with the strange partnership of two women separated by generations and joined by a debt neither of them had created, but both had inherited. When they finally left the storage unit, the rain had stopped. For a moment, sunlight broke through the clouds and struck the wet pavement. Lily carried one box. Eleanor carried the envelope and Samuel Reed's statement. Neither woman spoke much. Some truths are too large for immediate conversation. Then Eleanor noticed the black car across the street. It was parked near a loading entrance, engine running, windows tinted. Lily noticed it a second later, and the color drained from her face. She knew that car. Not personally, perhaps, but by type. Langford Security used vehicles like that when discretion mattered more than hospitality. Victor had found them, or at least he had found enough. The car did not move as they walked toward Lily's borrowed vehicle. That was worse somehow. It did not need to chase them. It only needed to watch, to record, to remind them that power had eyes. Lily fumbled with the keys. Eleanor kept her pace steady. Inside her coat, the document seemed heavier than paper. By the time they pulled away, Lily was shaking. Eleanor looked out the rear window and saw the black car follow. For several miles, the city passed in fragments. Wet streets, gray buildings, pedestrians with umbrellas, buses sighing at curbs. Lily wanted to panic, and Eleanor could feel it. The girl had grown up around power, but not against it. There is a difference. Being near powerful people can make someone believe power is invincible. Eleanor knew better. Power made mistakes when it got arrogant. It overreached. It assumed fear would do its work forever. She instructed Lily to drive not to a lawyer's office, not to the estate, not to Eleanor's apartment, but to Street, Agnes Community Center. Lily glanced at her, confused. Eleanor explained that decades earlier, when Langford's earliest drivers needed meals during strikes, St. Agnes had fed them. When families in worker housing needed legal clinics, St. Agnes hosted them. When Eleanor herself had nowhere to go after her dismissal, St. Agnes had given her a room for 2 nights and a phone to call her brother's hospital. It was not glamorous. It was not powerful. But it had something Langford offices did not. Witnesses who could not be bought easily because they had already lived without being bought at all. At Street, Agnes, they were met by Reverend Paul Mercer, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, whose kindness had edges sharpened by years of fighting landlords, budget cuts, and men in suits who called displacement opportunity. Eleanor had known him when he was a young volunteer, with more idealism than patience. Now his hair had gone white, but his eyes were the same. He recognized Eleanor instantly, and for the first time that day, her composure nearly failed. There are people who remember us before the world breaks us. Seeing them again can be a kind of mercy. Inside the community center, beneath fluorescent lights and children's drawings taped to the walls, Eleanor placed the documents on a folding table. Lily explained what they had found. Reverend Mercer listened without interrupting, his expression growing heavier with every page. When he reached Samuel Reed's statement, he removed his glasses and sat back. He knew what the documents meant, not just legally, morally, historically. Langford Global's redevelopment project depended on a story of benevolent legacy. It depended on the idea that the company had always lifted communities, always honored workers, always transformed hardship into opportunity. But if the world learned that the empire had been built by stealing ownership from a working woman, destroying her reputation, and then planning to demolish the housing of the very people who helped build its rise, the Memorial Plaza would become a monument to hypocrisy. Victor could survive a viral video of rudeness. He might not survive proof of inherited theft tied to a current act of displacement. Reverend Mercer made calls. Not many. Only the right ones. A retired judge who volunteered at the legal clinic. A journalist known for refusing corporate favors. A housing attorney already preparing opposition to Langford's project. a former Langford driver whose father had worked under Eleanor's restructuring plan and still kept old payroll records in his basement. Within 2 hours, the folding table at Street Atour, Agnes became something Victor Langford had never feared, because he had never truly understood it. A room full of ordinary people connecting memory to evidence. And while that room formed, Victor made his next mistake. He issued a second statement. This one was not merely cold. It was aggressive. It claimed that the elderly worker from the gala had a history of disruptive behavior. It implied she had approached Langford family members with suspicious intent. It suggested the viral clip lacked context and that the company was reviewing possible legal action against those spreading misinformation. Victor believed he was regaining control by turning Eleanor from victim into threat. But cruelty recorded in public has a way of awakening private memory. After the statement, people began posting their own stories. Former employees wrote about Victor's temper. Contract workers described humiliation hidden behind non-disclosure agreements. Residents from the old housing block shared notices and photographs of buildings Langford planned to erase. A retired nurse wrote that Eleanor Hayes had once paid for medicine for a neighbor's child when no one else helped. An old driver's son posted that his father always said a woman named Eleanor had saved Langford before Langford pretended she never existed. At first, these were only scattered sparks. Then, the journalist from Street, Agnes, published the first article. Not the full story. Not yet. Only enough to widen the crack. The article identified Eleanor by name. It described the gala incident. It connected her to early Langford history through archived photographs and former worker testimony. It raised questions about the redevelopment project and the company's treatment of low-wage staff. It mentioned, carefully, that new documents had surfaced regarding a disputed ownership agreement from the company's formative years. Victor exploded. Inside Langford headquarters, phones rang without rest. Board members demanded briefings. Public relations consultants begged for restraint. Legal counsel warned Victor not to make statements without review. But Victor had never been good at restraint when his pride was bleeding. He wanted Eleanor discredited immediately. He wanted Lily brought home. He wanted the storage unit located and sealed. He wanted every person at Street. Agnes reminded that Langford donations had kept community programs alive for years. And there, finally, the mask slipped in front of the wrong people. During an emergency call with senior executives, Victor raged that the company should have buried Eleanor Hayes properly the first time. He meant legally. He meant reputationally. He meant historically. But one executive on that call, a woman who had survived Victor's leadership by recording meetings for her own protection, saved the audio. By sunrise, she had sent it anonymously to the journalist. The story was no longer about a broken glass. It was about a broken empire. And Eleanor, who had spent half her life being told she was too small to matter, sat in the community center kitchen with a cup of tea cooling between her hands, listening as the world finally began saying her name. By the second morning after the gala, Eleanor Hayes had become the kind of name powerful people feared most. A name they had once erased, now spoken by strangers who wanted to know why. At first, Langford Global tried to treat the scandal like a small public relations fire. They had survived protests before. They had survived lawsuits, whistleblower complaints, and articles written by journalists who eventually moved on to newer disasters. The company's leadership believed outrage had a short life. They believed the public would be angry for a few days, perhaps a week, and then attention would drift toward something louder, fresher, easier to understand. That was how modern shame often worked. It burned hot and then disappeared. But this time, the story did not disappear because the wound beneath it was older than the video. The clip of Victor humiliating Eleanor had given people a face. The documents from Samuel Reed's storage unit gave that face a history. The redevelopment project gave that history a present danger. And suddenly, what had looked like one rich man insulting one poor worker became something larger, something uglier, something the city recognized in its own bones. It became a story about who gets remembered, who gets paid, who gets blamed, and who is expected to vanish quietly so the powerful can stand on polished marble and call it legacy. At Street, Agnes Community Center, the folding table became crowded with paper. The retired judge sorted documents into piles. The housing attorney created a timeline. The journalist worked carefully, refusing to publish faster than the evidence could support, because she understood that Victor's lawyers were waiting for one mistake. Lily sat near the end of the table, pale with exhaustion, answering questions about family archives, board procedures, and the redevelopment committee. Mara arrived after her morning shift with swollen eyes and a written statement about the shattered glass. Still terrified but no longer silent, Reverend Mercer moved from person to person with coffee, phone numbers, and the kind of calm that made fear feel less lonely. Eleanor watched them all from a chair near the window. For decades, the truth had lived in boxes, letters, memories, and the private ache of one woman's life. Now it had become a shared burden. That should have comforted her, and in some ways it did. But it also frightened her more than she expected. When pain is yours alone, you learn its shape. You know where it sits in the body. You know which mornings it will hurt and which names will reopen it. But when pain becomes public, it changes. Other people touch it, interpret it, argue over it, use it. And Eleanor, who had spent years trying not to be noticed, now found herself at the center of a storm that had waited 48 years to break. The journalist wanted to interview her on record. Eleanor refused at first, not because she was hiding, and not because she was ashamed. She refused because she did not want the story reduced to an old woman's suffering. She knew how easily sympathy could become entertainment. People might cry over her lost years, share the video, condemn Victor, and still forget the residents facing eviction from the old worker housing. They might admire her strength while ignoring the system that had required it. Eleanor did not want pity to become a curtain drawn over the deeper theft. So she made one thing clear through Reverend Mercer and the attorney. If her name was going to be spoken, it would be spoken alongside the names of the workers, drivers, widows, and families Langford had stepped over on its way to greatness. The story would not be about one broken glass. It would not even be only about one stolen agreement. It would be about the long habit of powerful people taking from the invisible and then naming themselves generous. That decision changed the direction of everything. The journalist's second article did not begin with the gala. It began with the old warehouse district, with photographs of families who had lived beside Langford's first loading docks, with interviews from retired workers who remembered Eleanor not as a cleaner, not as a roomer, but as the woman who had kept the company alive when the Langford brothers were still learning how to lead. It described how the redevelopment project would remove the last physical traces of that early community while building a memorial plaza that credited only the family. It laid out the newly discovered documents carefully: the ownership agreement, the internal memos, Samuel Reed's statement, and Thomas Langford's apology letter. It did not accuse beyond what it could prove. It did something more dangerous. It asked questions that had obvious answers. By noon, the article was everywhere. By 2, investors began calling. By 4, the city council postponed the redevelopment hearing. By sunset, the board of Langford Global announced an emergency meeting. Victor had expected anger. He had not expected consequence. Inside the executive floor, where glass walls and expensive silence made every crisis feel manageable, Victor stood before his advisors and insisted that the company was under attack. That was always the first refuge of men like him. When evidence appeared, they called it an attack. When witnesses spoke, they called it coordination. When the truth threatened power, they called the truth dangerous. He wanted private investigators assigned to Eleanor, to Mara, to Reverend Mercer, to the journalist, and even to Lily, especially to Lily. His sister's betrayal burned worse than the article because it came from inside the family walls. But the company lawyers were no longer as obedient as he expected. They had read enough to understand the risk. If the documents were authentic, the company faced not only reputational damage, but a potential ownership claim tied to decades of unpaid value. Even if legal limitations complicated the matter, the moral and financial exposure was enormous. Worse, the false accusation against Eleanor could open questions about fraud, concealment, and deliberate destruction of records. The lawyers did not say all of that in dramatic terms. Lawyers rarely need drama when fear is already in the room. They simply advised Victor to stop speaking publicly, preserve all records, and avoid contacting witnesses. Victor heard disloyalty in every word. His father, Charles Langford, joined the meeting remotely from the family estate. Charles had spent his life benefiting from the empire his father and uncle left behind, while perfecting the art of distance. He never denied wrongdoing directly. He preferred fog. He preferred phrases about complicated times, unclear memories, and decisions made by previous generations. He had taught Victor that family survival mattered more than family honesty. Yet even Charles sounded unsettled now, because the scandal had reached backward into a past he had spent years refusing to examine. Lily listened from street. Agnes, as the board secretary, forwarded notice of the emergency meeting to all voting members and foundation representatives. Her name remained on one committee list because Victor had not yet removed her formally. That small oversight mattered. It meant she could attend. It meant she could speak. It meant she could place evidence into the official record before Victor had time to bury it under procedure. The retired judge understood the importance immediately. He explained that public outrage could pressure a company, but official records could trap it. If Lily entered the documents into the board proceedings, Victor could no longer claim later that the allegations were merely rumors from outside agitators. The company would have been notified. The directors would have a duty to respond. Silence would become complicity. Delay would become evidence of intent. Lily looked at the documents, then at Eleanor. All her life, she had been told that the Langford name was a responsibility. She was only beginning to understand that responsibility did not mean protecting the name from shame. It meant protecting the truth from the name. The board meeting was scheduled for the next morning. That night, Victor went to the family estate. He did not go to rest. He went to control. The estate sat behind iron gates on a hill above the city, surrounded by old trees and older secrets. From the outside, it looked like permanence made stone. Inside, it was a museum of selective memory. Portraits of Langford men lined the hallways. Awards filled glass cases. Photographs of ribbon cuttings and hospital wings and scholarship ceremonies covered the walls. There were no photographs of Eleanor Hayes. No photographs of the drivers who slept in trucks during the company's first winter. No photographs of the clerks who worked unpaid overtime to save accounts. No photographs of the worker housing now marked for demolition. Victor found Lily in their grandmother's old sitting room. She had returned only to collect the last items her grandmother had left behind, including the photograph of Eleanor at the original office. Mrs. Calloway had warned her that Victor was in the house, but Lily stayed. Running had protected the family's life for too long. Victor entered with the quiet rage of someone trying not to break furniture. He had always known how to make a room smaller. As children, he had done it with mockery. As adults, he did it with money, titles, and threats disguised as concern. He told Lily that she was being manipulated by people who hated success. He told her Eleanor was using her guilt. He told her the documents were probably incomplete, stolen, or misunderstood. He told her that if she helped damage the company, thousands of employees could suffer, families could lose income, and charities could lose funding. It was a clever argument, because it borrowed the language of responsibility. But Lily saw the emptiness underneath. Men like Victor often hide behind the innocent people connected to their power. They harm workers, then claim workers will suffer if anyone exposes them. They take from communities, then warn that communities cannot survive without their donations. They build a machine on injustice, then accuse anyone who touches the machine of endangering all the people trapped inside it. For years, that argument might have silenced Lily. Not now, she told him, carefully and without the theatrical courage people imagine in such moments, that the company was already damaged, not by Eleanor, not by Mara, not by the journalist. It was damaged by what had been done, and what he was still trying to do. Victor heard only defiance. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, reminding her that the family could cut her off, remove her from committees, challenge her access, and make sure the world saw her as unstable. He wanted fear to return to its old place inside her, and for a moment, it almost did. Lily remembered being 16 and watching Victor destroy a housekeeper's career over a missing watch later found in his own gym bag. She remembered being 23 and seeing him take credit for a foundation program she had built quietly for 2 years. She remembered every family dinner where her objections became jokes, every meeting where he interrupted her until she stopped trying, every warning that kindness made her naive. Fear knew the way back into her body. Then she looked at the photograph in her hand. Young Eleanor stood in front of the old Langford office. Not wealthy, not protected, not famous, but alive with purpose. Behind her, the sign on the building looked crooked. The windows looked dirty. Nothing about the image suggested empire. Yet there was strength in it, a kind of beginning that the portraits in the hallway lacked. Lily realized then that her family had not only stolen Eleanor's ownership, they had stolen the company's better origin. The possibility that Langford could have become great without becoming cruel. Victor reached for the photograph. Lily did not let him take it. That refusal, small as it looked, marked the end of something between them. Victor saw it too. His face changed. Not with grief, but with calculation. If Lily could not be controlled as a sister, she would be handled as a liability. Before dawn, a petition circulated among certain board members questioning Lily's fitness to participate in the emergency meeting because of alleged emotional involvement with hostile outside parties. Victor's allies moved quickly, but not quickly enough. Mrs. Calloway had spent too many years serving tea to men who underestimated servants. By breakfast, copies of the petition had reached Lily, Reverend Mercer, and the journalist. By 8, the journalist published a brief update stating that Langford Global appeared to be attempting to silence an internal family member connected to documents under review. By 9, the board chair's office was flooded with calls. By 10, Lily's access was restored. Victor's first trap had failed, so he prepared a second one. The emergency board meeting took place on the 32nd floor of Langford headquarters, in a room designed to make dissent feel expensive. The table was dark walnut. The city stretched behind the windows. Every chair seemed positioned to remind its occupant that power preferred order. Eleanor had never entered that room before. Decades earlier, when her work saved the company, decisions were made in cramped offices and late-night kitchens. Now the empire she helped build looked down on the city like it had never depended on anyone below. She did not attend as a board member. She attended as a witness, accompanied by the retired judge, the housing attorney, Reverend Mercer, Mara, and Lily. Victor objected before she even sat down. His lawyers objected more politely. They questioned process, relevance, document custody, and security. The board chair, a woman named Adrienne Cole, listened without expression. Adrienne had served on the board for 9 years. Victor had always considered her useful because she rarely spoke unless necessary. That was his mistake. Quiet people are often mistaken for weak people by those who only recognize power when it interrupts. Adrienne had spent the night reading the articles, reviewing internal risk reports, and asking why the company's official history had so many missing pages. By morning, she was not ready to defend Eleanor, but she was ready to hear her. That alone made her dangerous to Victor. The meeting began with legal summaries. Then Victor spoke. He performed concern beautifully. He spoke of protecting employees, preserving shareholder value, respecting due process, and avoiding emotional decisions based on viral outrage. He did not deny that the gala incident looked unfortunate. He regretted how it had been perceived. He respected the dignity of all workers. He welcomed a review. Every sentence was polished enough to sound humane and empty enough to hold no accountability. Eleanor listened. She had heard polished emptiness before. Then Lily presented the documents. Not dramatically, not with accusation in her voice. She simply entered them into the record one by one. The duplicate ownership agreement, the internal memos, the restricted storage index, Samuel Reed's statement, Thomas Langford's letter, the early expansion ledger pages in Eleanor's handwriting, and the archive photographs confirming document custody before anyone at Street. Agnes touched the boxes. The retired judge explained the significance. The housing attorney connected the historical record to the current redevelopment project. Mara gave her statement about the glass incident and Victor's false complaint. Reverend Mercer spoke about the residents facing removal and the community history Langford had ignored. With every document, Victor grew less still. His allies tried to slow the process with questions. They asked whether old documents could be authenticated. They asked whether memories after so many years were reliable. They asked whether a company should be punished for the actions of dead men. These were not unreasonable questions in form, but their timing revealed their purpose. They were not searching for truth. They were building fog. Then Adrienne Cole asked the question that cut through it. She wanted to know why Victor had filed a formal complaint against Eleanor after the gala claiming aggression, when video evidence and witness testimony suggested she had been the one publicly mistreated. For the first time, Victor had no polished answer ready. He reached for procedure, then for confusion, then for the possibility that staff had misunderstood. But the board chair did not let the question dissolve. She asked whether he personally approved the complaint. The room changed. Even Victor's allies became careful. There are moments when loyalty becomes expensive, and people begin counting the cost in silence. Victor admitted, indirectly, that he had authorized a response based on information available at the time. Mara's hands shook in her lap. Eleanor noticed. Without turning the moment into spectacle, she placed her own hand gently over the young woman's. That small gesture did more than comfort Mara. It revealed something to the room. Victor had blamed Eleanor for a girl's mistake. Eleanor had protected the girl who failed to defend her. The moral contrast did not need explanation. Then the anonymous audio was played. The recording from Victor's emergency call filled the boardroom with his own voice. Stripped of polish, in it, he spoke of burying Eleanor properly the first time. He spoke of pressure, containment, and neutralizing sympathy before the situation infected the redevelopment vote. He did not confess to the original theft because he had not committed that one himself. But he confessed to the family instinct that had preserved it. Bury the woman, save the name. The silence afterward was different from the silence in the ballroom. The ballroom silence had been cowardice. This silence was recognition. Victor tried to attack the recording. He questioned its legality, its context, its source, but the damage had already landed. The board members were no longer looking at Eleanor as a possible embarrassment, or at Lily as an emotional relative. They were looking at Victor as a risk, not a leader under pressure. A risk, and in corporate rooms, moral failure can be ignored for years. But risk has a language even cowards understand. Adrienne called for a temporary recess. No one moved at first. Eleanor looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere beyond the towers was the old warehouse district. Somewhere in that district, laundry hung from balconies Victor wanted demolished. Children walked past brick walls marked for luxury branding, and elderly residents opened mail they could barely understand from developers who called displacement transition. Eleanor thought of her younger self racing through account books beneath a leaking roof. She thought of Thomas Langford's promises. She thought of his failure. She thought of the years when her name existed only in rooms that could not protect her. Then she felt something unexpected. Not peace. Not yet. But space. For the first time in nearly half a century, the lie no longer filled the whole room. During the recess, Victor cornered his father in a private side office. Charles Langford looked older than he had the day before. Scandal ages people differently, depending on what they have been hiding. For Charles, the documents did not bring surprise so much as confirmation of what he had avoided knowing. He had inherited whispers. He had seen his father's late-life guilt. He had watched his mother lock drawers and stop conversations when Eleanor's name approached the air. He had chosen comfort over curiosity, and now comfort was collapsing. Victor wanted him to deny everything, to call the documents forgeries, to claim Thomas had been confused before his death, to use the family's remaining influence to force the board into delay. But Charles hesitated. That hesitation enraged Victor more than opposition would have, because Victor had built his life on the assumption that the family would always close ranks around him. Yet Charles, weak as he was, understood something. Victor did not. The old methods had depended on darkness. The documents were now copied, photographed, distributed, and partly published. The witnesses were no longer isolated. The public was watching. The board was nervous. The city council had paused the project. There was no clean burial left. Charles did not become brave. That would be too generous. He simply became afraid of the consequences of continued lying. Sometimes history turns, not because the guilty find conscience, but because fear finally changes sides. When the board reconvened, Charles requested permission to speak. The room tightened. He did not give Eleanor the full confession she deserved. Men like Charles rarely surrender all at once. But he admitted that his father had expressed regret about a woman who had been wronged in the company's early years. He admitted that the family had possessed materials related to Eleanor Hayes. Though he claimed not to have understood their full significance, he admitted that the official company history may have omitted important contributions from non-family figures. Each admission was careful, limited, lawyer-shaped, but each one cracked the wall Victor was trying to hold upright. Victor stared at his father as if betrayal had entered the family through the wrong door. Then Eleanor asked to speak. She had not planned a speech. She had never trusted speeches much. Speeches had been used for decades to praise values the company did not practice. But when Adrienne nodded, Eleanor stood with one hand on the table, not because she wanted drama, but because her knees hurt after a long morning, and she refused to hide that either. She did not tell the room she wanted revenge. She did not ask them to feel sorry for her. She did not describe every year of poverty, every humiliation, every job lost because of whispers planted long ago. She spoke instead about work, the kind of work that does not appear in annual reports, the work of balancing accounts when owners panic, calling drivers' wives when routes run late, finding fuel when tanks are empty, remembering whose child is sick, whose rent is due, whose truck needs repairs before a winter storm. She spoke about how companies love the word legacy because it sounds noble. But legacy is not what a family says after it is won. Legacy is what remains in the lives of the people it used on the way up. No one interrupted. Even Victor understood, perhaps for the first time, that Eleanor's quietness had never been emptiness. It had been restraint. And restraint, once released, did not need volume to be powerful. She ended by making the demand no one expected. She did not begin with money. She demanded that the redevelopment project be suspended immediately. She demanded an independent historical review of Langford's founding, including worker testimony and public archives. She demanded that the old housing block be protected until residents had legal representation, relocation guarantees, and a voice in any future plan. She demanded that the false complaint against Mara and herself be withdrawn in writing. She demanded that the company acknowledge her contributions publicly, not as charity, not as symbolic apology, but as fact. Only after that, she said, would her legal team address the ownership claim. The order mattered. Victor had expected greed because greed was the language he understood. He had prepared to accuse her of wanting money. He had prepared to frame her as an opportunist. But Eleanor placed the community first, the young waitress second, the truth third, and herself last. That did not weaken her claim. It strengthened it in a way Victor could not easily attack. The board chair called for another private session. This time, Victor was asked to leave the room. He refused at first. No one moved to support him. That was the moment he began to understand that power is not the same as loyalty. People had followed him when he looked inevitable. Now he looked costly. The directors avoided his eyes. His father stared down at the table. The lawyers whispered to one another. Adrienne repeated the request. Still calm, still formal, and somehow more humiliating than anger. Victor left, but he did not leave defeated. Men like Victor do not experience consequences as correction. They experience them as insult, and insult, to them, demands retaliation. While the board debated behind closed doors, Victor went to his office, locked the door, and called the one person he believed could still shift the battlefield, Graham Vale. the private consultant who had managed Langford's most delicate problems for 15 years. Graham was not an employee on paper. He appeared nowhere in glossy reports. He specialized in pressure that left no fingerprints, background checks, donor whispers, reputation leaks, strategic lawsuits, anonymous tips, and carefully timed rumors. If Victor was the face of inherited arrogance, Graham was the machinery beneath it. Victor wanted Eleanor destroyed before the evening news cycle. Graham listened, then explained that the old methods were dangerous now. Too many people were watching. Too many documents had already been copied. But Victor insisted. He wanted the public conversation shifted from corporate theft to Eleanor's credibility. He wanted people asking why she had waited so long, whether she had financial motives, whether she had been unstable after her dismissal, whether she had manipulated Lily, whether Agnes was using the scandal to stop development. He wanted doubt seeded everywhere. Graham hesitated only once. Then he agreed. By late afternoon, anonymous accounts began posting fragments of Eleanor's past. Some were distorted truths. Some were outright lies. They mentioned her years of unstable employment after leaving Langford. They suggested she had made accusations against employers before. They questioned why she had no close family speaking on her behalf. One post implied that her brother's medical debts had given her motive to fabricate claims. Another used an old court filing from a rent dispute to paint her as irresponsible. The campaign was ugly because it was designed to be ugly, not convincing enough to prove anything, just poisonous enough to make casual observers pause. For Eleanor, the cruelty landed in a place she thought had scarred over. She had expected Victor to attack the documents. She had expected legal threats. She had not expected strangers to pick through the ruins of her life and turn survival into suspicion. There's a special violence in watching poverty used as evidence against the poor. Every late payment becomes a character flaw. Every illness becomes instability. Every absence of family becomes proof that something must be wrong with you. The world rarely asks what was done to make a person's life difficult. It only asks why the difficulty left marks. At Street, Agnes. Lily found Eleanor alone in the small chapel near the back of the building. The chapel was simple, almost plain, with wooden pews, stained glass faded by time, and a silence very different from the boardrooms. Eleanor sat with her coat folded beside her and Samuel Reed's statement in her hands. She did not cry loudly. She had never been granted that kind of freedom, but her face carried the exhaustion of someone being forced to prove, again and again, that her pain was not a performance. Lily apologized for what Victor was doing. Eleanor did not answer immediately. Then she asked a question that pierced Lily more deeply than anger could have. She wondered how many times her family had used the same method on someone else. How many workers had been dismissed and then described as difficult? How many tenants had resisted and then been painted as ungrateful? How many women had spoken and then been labeled unstable? How many stories had been buried not because they were false, but because the people telling them were too tired to fight the second battle after surviving the first? Lily had no answer. That was the beginning of her real education. Not the documents, not the photograph, not even the gala. The real education was understanding that Victor was not an exception to the family system. He was its most honest product. He had simply said and done openly what earlier generations had hidden behind manners, lawyers, and philanthropy. That evening, the board issued its first decision. Victor Langford was placed on temporary leave, pending independent investigation. The redevelopment project was suspended. The complaint against Eleanor and Mara was withdrawn. Langford Global announced that an external firm would review the newly surfaced historical documents and the company's early equity records. The statement was cautious, corporate, and far from full justice. But it was the first official crack in a lie that had stood for nearly 50 years. Outside headquarters, reporters gathered. At Street, Agnes, residents cheered. Mara cried in relief when she learned the complaint had been withdrawn. The staffing agency, sensing the wind had shifted, called to offer her assignments again. This time, Mara declined until they confirmed in writing that no retaliation would follow. Eleanor smiled when she heard that. A frightened girl had begun the week unable to admit she dropped a glass. She ended it demanding written protection from an agency that once scared her. That, too, was a kind of justice beginning in miniature. But Victor's leave did not satisfy the public for long, and it did not satisfy Eleanor at all. Temporary leave was a chair moved away from a table. It was not accountability. The company still had not admitted the theft. The ownership claim remained unresolved. The housing block remained vulnerable. Graham Vale's smear campaign was still spreading through corners of the internet, where cruelty enjoyed pretending to be skepticism. And Victor, though removed from official duties, still had money, allies, and the kind of wounded pride that could make a man reckless. He proved it the next night. A fire alarm went off at Street 2. Agnes, shortly after midnight. At first, everyone thought it was a malfunction. The building was old, and old buildings often protested in strange ways. But Reverend Mercer smelled smoke before the alarm finished its second cycle. It came from the administrative office near the back, where copies of the documents had been stored earlier that day before being moved to a secure legal archive. The fire was small, quickly contained, and no one was hurt. But the message was unmistakable. Someone wanted them afraid. Someone wanted them to imagine what might have happened if the originals had still been there. Police arrived. Fire officials inspected the damage. The community center volunteers stood outside in coats and blankets, watching smoke curl from a broken window into the cold night. Eleanor stood among them, her face lit by emergency lights. She did not need anyone to say Victor's name. Whether he had ordered it directly, hinted through Graham, or inspired someone desperate to please him, the fire belonged to the same logic as the false complaint. The smear campaign and the stolen agreement. Bury the woman. Burn the proof. Save the name. But this time, the old logic met a new world. Security footage from a nearby grocery store captured a man leaving the alley behind Street. Agnes, minutes before the alarm. The image was blurry, but his car was not. It belonged to a small security contractor used by Graham Vale's firm. By morning, the journalist had the footage. By noon, police had questions. By evening, Graham Vale's name appeared in the press for the first time. Victor's allies began fleeing him, not publicly, not with moral statements. They simply stopped answering calls. One board member canceled dinner. Another leaked that she had always supported a thorough investigation. A donor who had praised Victor 3 days earlier announced concern over governance culture. That is often how powerful men fall, not by sudden conscience around them, but by the rapid disappearance of people who once smiled in their photographs. Victor watched it happen from his penthouse above the river. He had been told to remain quiet. He had been told to let lawyers handle everything. He had been told that any further action could expose him personally. But isolation did not make him reflective. It made him furious. He replayed the gala video again and again, not to understand what he had done, but to identify the exact moment the room turned against him. He blamed the guest who recorded it. He blamed Lily for leaving the ballroom. He blamed Mara for crying. He blamed Eleanor for looking at him as if she remembered something he did not. That look haunted him, not because it made him feel guilty, because it made him feel seen. The next morning, Victor appeared at Street Agnes without warning. He arrived in a dark coat, alone, or at least appearing alone. Reporters were gathered across the street because of the fire, and perhaps that was why he came. He wanted images. He wanted the world to see him approaching the community center, not as a disgraced executive, but as a man willing to face his accusers. In his mind, performance could still rescue him. He believed that if he stood near Eleanor with the proper expression, if he offered regret without admission, if he invoked family pain and misunderstanding, he could soften the story before the investigation hardened it. Eleanor was in the community garden behind the center when he arrived. The garden had been planted by residents years earlier in old wooden boxes, stubborn green life growing between brick walls and chain-link fencing. It was not beautiful in the way wealthy people use the word, but it was loved. Children had painted stones along the path. Someone had tied ribbons to a fence after a neighbor survived surgery. In summer, tomatoes grew beside marigolds. In winter, the soil looked bare, but waiting. Victor should not have come there, not because it was dangerous for him, but because he did not understand places that were loved without being owned. He approached Eleanor with Reverend Mercer, Lily, and the journalist close enough to hear. Cameras watched from the sidewalk beyond the fence. Victor lowered his voice, but not enough to escape recording. He expressed regret for how events had unfolded. He spoke of pain on all sides. He said his family's history was complex, and that he hoped everyone could move forward with dignity. He did not say he was sorry for humiliating her. He did not say the complaint was false. He did not say the documents were real. He did not say the housing project was wrong. He offered fog again. This time, Eleanor did not let it settle. She looked at him for a long moment, the same way she had looked at him in the ballroom. Then she made clear, in that calm way of hers, that dignity was not something people moved forward with while stepping around the truth. Dignity required naming what had been done. It required repair. It required those who caused harm to stop asking the harmed to help them look gracious. Victor's expression tightened. The cameras were still watching, and he knew it. He tried to smile. He tried to turn the moment toward reconciliation. He suggested that Eleanor's legal representatives in the company could meet privately to discuss a resolution. Privately was the word that mattered. Privately was where Langford men had always done their best work. Private rooms had buried the agreement. Private memos had shaped the lie. Private pressure had followed the gala. Private settlements had kept workers quiet. Eleanor understood. She refused to make the truth private again. That refusal spread through the reporters before Victor even left the garden. By afternoon, the phrase was everywhere. Not because Eleanor had crafted it for publicity, but because it carried the force of a life lesson. The truth would not be made private again. For Victor, it was the final humiliation. For Eleanor, it was the first sentence of freedom. But the greatest reveal was still waiting. Hidden not in Samuel Reed's storage unit, not in the family archive, and not in Thomas Langford's apology letter. It was waiting in a place no one had searched, because no one believed an old woman with a small apartment could possess anything more powerful than memory. It was waiting in Eleanor's tin box, beneath the photograph, beneath the agreement, beneath the newspaper clippings, inside an envelope so faded that even she had almost forgotten why she kept it separate. That night, after the reporters left and Street, Agnes grew quiet. Eleanor opened the envelope again for the first time in years. Inside was a cassette tape, On its label, written in Thomas Langford's hand, were 3 words and a date. Not for court, for conscience. Eleanor held it beneath the kitchen light, feeling the past gather around her once more. She had never played the tape for anyone. Not after Thomas died. Not after her brother's funeral. Not during the years when lawyers would have dismissed it as too late, too emotional, too difficult to authenticate. She had kept it because some part of her could not throw away the last sound of the man who had betrayed her and regretted it too late. But now, with Victor still fighting, with the company still measuring justice against liability, with the housing block still waiting under threat, Eleanor understood that the tape was no longer a relic of private grief. It was evidence of a family secret even Lily did not know. And once the world heard Thomas Langford's own voice, the empire would not merely crack. It would have to choose whether to finally tell the truth or collapse beneath the weight of every lie it had ever protected. For a long time, Eleanor simply held the cassette in her hands. It looked too small to carry the weight of a buried life. Its plastic case was scratched, its paper label yellowed at the edges, and the ink had faded into the color of old bruises. Anyone else might have mistaken it for a forgotten piece of junk, the kind of thing found in a drawer after someone dies, kept only because throwing it away feels too final. But Eleanor knew better. She knew the sound trapped inside that cassette. She knew the voice. She knew the hesitation between words, the guilt pressed into every breath, the terrible weakness of a man who had understood the truth only after he had already allowed the lie to grow roots. Thomas Langford had sent it to her 3 months before his death. By then, he was no longer the confident founder whose face appeared in annual reports and museum plaques. Illness had thinned him. Regret had done worse. His handwriting had become uneven, and his letters arrived less like explanations than confessions, too late to become courage. Eleanor had not answered most of them. There are apologies that arrive after the damage is done and ask the wounded person to carry one more burden, the burden of making the guilty feel forgiven. She had not wanted that burden. The cassette had come wrapped in brown paper with no return address, though she knew immediately who had sent it. At the time, she owned no working player. For nearly a year, it remained unopened. Then, on a winter night, when loneliness made the past louder than usual, she borrowed an old tape recorder from a neighbor and listened. She had never listened again, not because the recording was unimportant, but because it was too important. Thomas's voice had carried the truth she had spent years trying to prove, but it had also carried the unbearable sound of a man asking the dead years to forgive him. Eleanor had placed the cassette in the tin box afterward and told herself there was no point. Her brother was gone. Her career was gone. The company had become too large to fight. Thomas was dying. What good could one recorded confession do against a city that had already chosen which version of history it preferred? Now, under the fluorescent light of Street Agnes Community Center, with smoke still faint in the walls from the fire and the city watching Langford Global stumble, Eleanor understood that the tape had waited for a different moment. It had waited until the lie was weak enough to hear it. Lily found her in the kitchen just after midnight. She had been speaking with the housing attorney, preparing for another round of meetings. But worry drew her toward Eleanor when she noticed the old woman had gone quiet. On the table between them lay the cassette, the faded envelope, and Thomas Langford's handwriting. Lily did not touch it. That restraint mattered to Eleanor. A younger version of Lily might have reached for the tape because she was a Langford, and Langfords were trained to believe every object connected to the family belonged to them. But this Lily simply sat across from Eleanor and waited. She was beginning to understand that truth was not found by grabbing. Sometimes it had to be received. Eleanor explained what the tape was, not with drama, but with the tired precision of someone who had spent a lifetime protecting herself from being misquoted. Thomas had recorded it near the end of his life. He had admitted the agreement was real. He had admitted Eleanor's work created the expansion model that made the company rich. He had admitted that the accusation against her had been manufactured by his brother, assisted by lawyers, and tolerated by him. But there was more. That was why Eleanor's voice changed when she reached the part she had never fully allowed herself to think about. The tape did not only confess to the theft, it identified the reason the Langford family had been so desperate to erase her. The 12% ownership agreement was valuable, but it was not the whole secret. Attached to Eleanor's restructuring plan had been another document, a worker participation covenant drafted during the company's most fragile years. It was meant to protect the independent drivers and early employees whose sacrifices made the expansion possible. If the plan succeeded, a portion of the profits from certain original assets, including the warehouse district and the surrounding worker housing, would be placed into a community benefit trust. The trust would fund housing stability, medical support, and education for families tied to Langford's early operations. Eleanor had written the first version herself. Thomas had signed it. His brother had hated it. At the time, the covenant seemed idealistic but manageable. Langford was still small. No one imagined those assets would later become some of the most valuable land in the city. No one imagined the warehouse district would transform from neglected industrial blocks into a prize developer circled like wolves. No one imagined a promise made to workers during desperate years would one day stand between the Langford family and hundreds of millions in redevelopment profit. But that was exactly what had happened. The redevelopment project Victor wanted to complete was not merely cruel. It was built on land that, if the covenant remained valid, the company had no moral right and possibly no legal right to sell without the consent of a trust that should have existed for decades. Lily covered her mouth as the meaning landed. Eleanor looked older in that moment, but not weaker. The years had carried this secret through her body without her knowing its full future shape. She had remembered the covenant. Yes, but over time she had assumed it was just another promise crushed under legal machinery. Thomas's tape suggested otherwise. He had not only signed it, he had recorded where a duplicate had been kept, who had witnessed it, and why his brother's legal team had worked so urgently to remove Eleanor from the company before the 5-year success condition made both her ownership and the worker covenant enforceable. Samuel Reed had preserved the ownership papers, but Thomas had hidden the covenant somewhere else. Not in the company archive, not in the storage unit, not at the estate. He had hidden it inside the cornerstone capsule of the original Langford warehouse, sealed during a publicity ceremony in 1982, before the betrayal was complete and before he fully surrendered to his brother's pressure. At the time, the capsule had been presented as a celebration of the company's future, filled with photographs, letters, and symbolic documents. But according to Thomas's recording, one of those symbolic documents was not symbolic at all. It was the signed covenant, placed there by Thomas himself in a final act of cowardly courage. He had not defended Eleanor publicly, but some part of him had tried to leave a trail for the future. That truth was almost too painful to admire. Thomas had been brave enough to hide evidence, but not brave enough to stop the harm. Eleanor knew the difference. By morning, the tape had been digitized, copied, and secured by the retired judge. An audio expert was contacted. The journalist was told only that another piece of evidence had surfaced, but not yet what it contained. The housing attorney studied the implications with growing intensity. If the covenant could be recovered and authenticated, it would change everything. The redevelopment project would not merely be delayed, it could be frozen indefinitely. The company could be forced to account for decades of unpaid obligations to a trust that should have supported the very families now facing removal. Victor had tried to humiliate a cleaner. He had accidentally awakened the woman who knew where the bones were buried. The problem was that the original warehouse was already fenced off for demolition preparation. Langford contractors had begun internal clearing before the city council postponed the public hearing. Officially, no major demolition was allowed yet. Unofficially, everyone knew how development worked. Walls were weakened. Records disappeared. Old fixtures were removed. Accidents happened. By the time anyone obtained an injunction, the thing worth preserving had often been damaged beyond repair. The cornerstone could not wait. The housing attorney filed an emergency motion. The journalist prepared a story about the possible historical covenant without revealing the exact location. Lily used her remaining access to obtain site schedules and discovered that a contractor had been ordered to perform unscheduled structural work near the warehouse entrance that afternoon. The order had not come through normal channels. It had come from a consultant connected to Graham Vale. Victor was still trying to bury the truth in real time. This time, he did not understand how many people were watching. By noon, residents from the old housing block gathered outside the warehouse fence. Not violently, not chaotically. They came with phones, handmade signs, folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, and the stubborn patience of people who had learned that survival often means showing up before anyone invites you. Former drivers arrived wearing old Langford jackets faded by years of use. Retired clerks brought photographs. Mothers came with children. Elderly tenants came with walkers. Reverend Mercer stood near the gate with Eleanor beside him, while Lily and the attorney argued with site managers who suddenly could not explain why workers had been sent there. The news cameras arrived shortly afterward. Victor arrived last. That was his mistake. Had he stayed away, he might have claimed ignorance. Had he allowed lawyers to speak, he might have preserved distance. But pride dragged him to the warehouse because he could not bear the sight of Eleanor standing before the first building his family had claimed as sacred ground. To him, the warehouse was branding. To her, it was memory. To the residents, it was proof that their lives had not begun as obstacles to luxury apartments. Victor stepped from his car into a crowd that no longer feared his name. He tried to frame the gathering as trespassing and interference with lawful development. He tried to suggest that rumors were being weaponized against a company that had served the city for generations. He tried to present himself as the reasonable man surrounded by emotion. But the cameras had seen too much by then. They had seen the gala video. They had read the documents. They had covered the fire at Street. Agnes. They had heard about Graham Vale. Victor's polished language no longer sounded like leadership. It sounded like habit. Eleanor stood near the fence, her small figure almost swallowed by the crowd around her. Yet when she moved closer, people made space. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The microphone from a local station caught her words clearly enough as she explained that before Langford became an empire, this warehouse had been held together by people whose names never appeared on plaques. She explained that a promise had been made to those people. She explained that the company's own founder had left evidence that the promise had been hidden. And she asked, not for permission, but for preservation. No stone should be moved until the truth inside it had been examined. The phrase spread before the hour ended. No stone should be moved. For a company built on polished foundations, it was devastating. The court order arrived at 3:17 in the afternoon. Temporary injunction. All work stopped. Site secured pending inspection for potentially relevant historical and legal materials. Victor's face changed when the order was read aloud. He looked, for one moment, like a boy denied something he believed birth had promised him. Then the anger returned, but it had nowhere useful to go. Cameras watched. Police stood nearby. Board representatives had arrived. The contractor stepped back. The cornerstone inspection took place the following morning. Eleanor almost did not attend. Part of her wanted to remain at home, to let younger people handle the dust and the microphones and the legal formalities. She had already given so much of herself to the past. But Reverend Mercer reminded her, gently, that some doors should be opened in the presence of the person they were closed against. So Eleanor came, wearing the same black coat she had worn to the gala. Though Lily had offered to buy her something new, Eleanor refused. The coat had carried the envelope. It had carried the insult. It would carry the return. The warehouse entrance was colder than she remembered. The sign above it had been removed years earlier, replaced by temporary development banners now hanging loose in the wind. Workers exposed the cornerstone carefully under the supervision of preservation officials, attorneys, cameras, and witnesses. Every movement was documented, every tool logged, every fragment handled as if the building itself had become testimony. When the capsule emerged, dull and sealed, the crowd outside fell into a silence so complete that the city noise beyond the fence seemed far away. Inside were the expected artifacts: old photographs, a newspaper, a ceremonial letter from Thomas Langford, a company badge, a route map, and a list of early employees. Then the preservation official removed a sealed packet wrapped in waxed cloth. Eleanor knew before it was opened. Some forms of recognition happened beneath thought. Her body remembered the paper, the size, the fold, the old ache of hope. The packet contained the Worker Participation Covenant, signed by Thomas Langford, his brother, Eleanor Hayes, 2 witnesses, and notarized by Samuel Reed. Attached to it was an addendum confirming Eleanor's authorship of the restructuring model and linking the covenant's activation to the same performance milestones described in her ownership agreement. There were also handwritten notes in Thomas's hand, acknowledging that the company's early expansion depended on sacrifices made by workers and that future prosperity should not erase them. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the housing attorney lowered his head, not in defeat, but in the stunned respect that comes when law and justice, so often separated, suddenly stand near each other. Lily began to cry again. Mara, standing beside a group of residents, gripped the fence with both hands. Reverend Mercer closed his eyes. Former workers embraced one another. Reporters spoke into cameras with voices that shook despite their training. And Eleanor stood still, looking at her own signature from 44 years earlier. The signature was bold. That surprised her. She had remembered being tired when she signed. She had remembered the office smelling of coffee, dust, and rain. She had remembered Thomas smiling with relief. She had remembered believing, foolishly but beautifully, that men who made promises in hard times would honor them in good ones. But she had forgotten the confidence in her own hand. The young Eleanor who signed that document had not felt small. She had known her worth. The world had spent decades teaching her to shrink afterward. Now her own signature taught her back. The legal consequences came fast, not complete, not simple, but fast enough to feel like a dam breaking. The court extended the injunction. The city suspended all redevelopment approvals. Langford Global's board announced that Victor's temporary leave had become immediate termination for cause, pending further investigation into witness intimidation, misuse of company resources, and actions related to the attempted destruction or concealment of evidence. Graham Vale was questioned by authorities, then abandoned by clients who suddenly claimed they had never really understood his methods. The contractor linked to the warehouse order cooperated quickly once he realized he was not being protected. Charles Langford resigned from the family foundation. His statement was as careful as ever. But this time, careful was not enough to save him from shame. He admitted that the family had failed to confront serious wrongs in its history, and that the company's legacy required repair beyond words. It was not the confession Eleanor deserved, but it was the first public admission by a Langford elder that the myth had been false. Victor did not resign from anything willingly. He fought. He threatened lawsuits. He claimed the board had panicked under media pressure. He accused Lily of conspiring with activists. He suggested Eleanor was being manipulated by lawyers who wanted a payday. But every accusation weakened him because every new investigation found more. Messages connected him to Graham's smear campaign. Financial records linked Langford discretionary funds to surveillance of Street. Agnes. The false complaint after the gala had his approval trail attached. The attempted warehouse work had been requested through intermediaries or too close to him to explain away. And then came the poetic justice. No one planned, but everyone understood. Victor had spent his career building the redevelopment project as the monument to his leadership. It was supposed to be his signature achievement, the project that would separate him from his father, modernize the family brand, and place his name permanently in the city's skyline. Instead, the land he tried to clear became the center of the Eleanor Hayes Worker Trust. The very covenant his family buried was revived through a settlement overseen by the court, negotiated under pressure from shareholders, residents, and the public. Langford Global agreed to fund the trust with a historic payment representing decades of unpaid obligations, along with future revenue shares from any development involving the original warehouse district. The old housing block was not demolished. It was transferred into a protected community ownership structure, renovated with trust funds, and guaranteed long-term affordability for residents. The Memorial Plaza was canceled. In its place, the restored warehouse became the Hayes Reed Community Archive and Training Center, named for Eleanor Hayes and Samuel Reed, the woman who built the model and the clerk who preserved the proof when he lacked the courage to do more. Victor's name appeared nowhere on it. That absence wounded him more deeply than any fine. For a man obsessed with legacy, erasure became the punishment he had tried to impose on others. He had wanted Eleanor removed through the service entrance, unnamed in company statements, dismissed from work, discredited online, and buried beneath procedure. Instead, his own leadership was removed from the company history with a precision that felt almost surgical. Future reports referred to his tenure only in relation to governance failure and the Hayes investigation. Business schools studied the scandal not as a triumph of his ambition, but as a case in inherited arrogance, reputational collapse, and the cost of mistaking silence for consent. He was not ruined into poverty. Men like Victor rarely fall that far. But he lost the thing he valued most: unquestioned importance. Invitations stopped. Calls went unanswered. People who once leaned toward him at dinners now found reasons to speak to someone else. His lawsuits dragged, narrowed, and failed to restore what he wanted. The world did not forget him, which might have been mercy. It remembered him exactly as he had revealed himself, standing over an old woman beside a broken glass, unaware that he was the one about to shatter. Mara's life changed too, though not in the loud way cameras prefer. The trust created a scholarship fund for workers in service jobs, pursuing education, and Mara became its first recipient. She continued working for a while, not because she had to accept humiliation, but because she no longer carried the same fear into every room. She learned how to ask for written policies. She learned how to document mistreatment. She learned that kindness did not require silence. Years later, when she spoke to new scholarship students, she did not describe herself as brave on the night of the gala. She told them she had been afraid and had failed at first. But someone she failed to defend had still shown her mercy. That mercy became the door through which she found courage. Lily left the Langford estate within a month, not in anger alone, though anger was there. She left because she understood that some houses are built to keep people loyal to ghosts. She resigned from the Family Foundation after helping transfer its remaining community programs under independent oversight. Then, at Eleanor's urging, she joined the board of the new trust, not as a Langford representative, but as a non-voting advisor for historical accountability. That distinction mattered. Eleanor would not allow another Langford, even a repentant one, to sit above the people whose lives the trust existed to protect. Lily accepted that. It was perhaps the first truly humble thing she had ever done. Her relationship with Eleanor did not become sentimental overnight. Life is rarely that neat. There were wounds between them that apology could not dissolve quickly. Sometimes Lily still spoke too carefully, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Sometimes Eleanor still withdrew when kindness from a Langford felt too close to old promises. But slowly, through shared work rather than grand declarations, something honest grew. Lily visited Streeto. Agnes. She listened to residents. She helped sort archives without asking to be praised for it. She brought her grandmother's hidden photograph and gave it to Eleanor, who donated it to the community archive only after making a copy for her own apartment. On the day the Hayes Reed Center opened, the city came in numbers no one expected. There were former workers with canes and grandchildren, residents who had nearly lost their homes, students from the scholarship fund, journalists who had followed the story from the beginning, board members trying to look sincere, and ordinary people who had watched the video of the gala and wanted to witness the ending. The restored warehouse doors stood open. Inside, the walls displayed not only the company's corrected history, but the names of drivers, clerks, cleaners, dispatchers, mechanics, and families who had carried the invisible weight of the empire's beginning. Eleanor did not want to speak. Everyone wanted her to. In the end, she agreed only because Reverend Mercer reminded her that some words are not speeches. Some are returns. She stood at the entrance where the cornerstone had once hidden the covenant. The black uniform from the gala was gone, but not forgotten. She wore a simple blue dress Lily had helped her choose, though Eleanor insisted on her old shoes because they were comfortable and because dignity had never required new leather. When the crowd quieted, she looked out at the faces before her and seemed, for a moment, to be looking beyond them too, back to the young woman in the old photograph, back to the night shifts, back to her brother's hospital room, back to Thomas Langford's hallway silence, back to the ballroom where a powerful man had mistaken humility for weakness. She did not tell the crowd that justice fixed everything, because it had not. No settlement could return 48 years. No apology could give her brother more time. No public plaque could erase the nights she went hungry, the jobs she lost, or the years she believed the world had chosen the lie permanently. Eleanor knew better than to pretend justice was magic. Justice did not undo suffering. It gave suffering a witness. It placed truth where denial used to stand. It made the next theft harder. That was enough to make it holy. She spoke of work, memory, and the danger of calling people invisible simply because one has chosen not to see them. She reminded the crowd that the first cruelty in many great injustices is not the final act of theft, but the small permission people give themselves to look away. A room does not become cruel only because one man humiliates someone. It becomes cruel when everyone else decides comfort is more important than courage. The ballroom had taught her that Saint. Agnes had taught her the opposite. One room had watched her kneel alone. Another had stood until the truth could stand with her. Near the back of the crowd, Mara cried openly. Lily held the copied photograph against her chest. Mrs. Calloway stood beneath a window, smiling in the quiet way of women who had carried secrets across decades and finally set them down. After the ceremony, Eleanor walked through the archive alone for a few minutes. She saw the original route maps, the ledger pages, Samuel Reed's statement, Thomas Langford's letter, the covenant, and the photograph of herself at 26. Her younger face looked out from behind the glass with that bold, forgotten confidence. Eleanor stood before it for a long time. For years, she had thought of that young woman with sorrow. Now she felt something else. Gratitude. The young Eleanor had signed her name boldly. She had written the plan. She had believed workers deserved protection before anyone praised such language in public reports. She had trusted the wrong men. Yes, but trust was not the shame. Betrayal was. And finally, after nearly half a century, the shame had traveled back to where it belonged. That evening, after the crowds left and the center lights softened, Eleanor returned to her apartment. It was still small. The alley still smelled like bread in the mornings and rain on old brick in the evenings. Her kettle still whistled too loudly. Her chair by the window still creaked. But the apartment no longer felt like the hiding place of a woman erased. It felt like the home of a woman who had survived long enough to hear the world correct itself. On her kitchen table sat two things. The first was the final settlement letter, confirming her restored ownership value, much of which she had already directed into the trust, the scholarship fund, and legal support for displaced workers across the city. She kept enough to live without fear. That was all she wanted. Enough to pay rent without counting coins. Enough for medicine without choosing between pain and groceries. Enough to buy flowers on her brother's birthday and take a taxi when her knees hurt. The second was the broken stem of a crystal glass. Mara had found it after the gala, tucked near the service corridor, and kept it. Months later, she gave it to Eleanor, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a reminder of the moment everything began to change. Eleanor had placed it in a small dish by the window. In the morning light, it caught the sun and scattered it across the table in bright fragments. Glass breaks easily. So do lies. Once enough light gets in, Eleanor lived many years after that. Longer than some expected. Not because justice made her young again, but because peace can return strength to places grief has occupied for too long. She spent her mornings at the archive twice a week, helping students understand the difference between official history and honest history. She corrected dates. She identified faces in old photographs. She insisted that cleaners, drivers, and clerks be named properly. When visitors asked whether she hated the Langfords, she did not answer simply. Hatred, she had learned, can become another room. One is trapped inside. She did not want to live in any room built by them. But she also did not offer cheap forgiveness. She believed forgiveness without truth was only another form of silence. She believed mercy without repair protected the wrong person. She believed dignity was not proven by how quietly someone endured humiliation, but by whether they refused to pass that humiliation down to someone weaker. That was why people kept coming to hear her story. Not because it was only about a corporation, not because it was only about money, not because it was only about one cruel man at one elegant gala. People came because they recognized the pattern, somewhere in their own lives. They had seen a room go silent when it should have spoken. They had seen someone blamed because they were easier to blame than the truth. They had seen powerful people use politeness as a weapon and paperwork as a shovel. They had seen how quickly the world can mistake a uniform for a person's worth. And Eleanor's story gave them a different ending. It reminded them that the person kneeling on the floor may be the one who built the foundation. The worker carrying trays may be carrying a truth no executive can survive. The old woman everyone ignores may remember the beginning better than the family that claimed it. And the smallest act of public cruelty may open the door to a justice that has been waiting for decades. In the end, Victor Langford was right about one thing, though not in the way he intended. The gala did become a lesson, but it was not a lesson about standards. It was not a lesson about discipline. It was not a lesson about putting people in their place. It became a lesson about what happens when a man who inherited power mistakes silence for weakness, and what happens when the woman he humiliates has carried the truth longer than he has carried his name. So remember this: never measure a person's value by the work they are forced to do, the clothes they are made to wear, or the silence they keep in a room full of cowards. Some people are quiet because they are afraid. Some are quiet because they are tired. And some are quiet because they know the truth does not need to shout forever. It only needs the right moment to be heard. And when that moment comes, even an empire built on marble can tremble beneath the footsteps of one forgotten woman walking back through the door. If you believe dignity should never depend on wealth, status, or power, remember Eleanor Hayes. And if this story moved you, leave a like. Share it with someone who still believes kindness is weakness. And tell us in the comments, would you have stayed silent in that ballroom? Or would you have stood beside her? Years after the gala, people still remembered the sound of the glass, not because the glass itself mattered, and not because broken crystal was unusual in rooms where wealth gathered too closely around fragile things. People remembered it because everything that followed seemed to begin with that sound. A sharp crack against marble, a room turning silent, a powerful man choosing cruelty because he believed no one important would care, an old woman lowering herself to the floor, not knowing that the moment meant to shame her would become the doorway through which the truth walked back into the world. In the archive, the broken stem of that glass was eventually displayed beside a small plaque. Eleanor resisted the idea at first. She thought it felt too dramatic, too close to turning pain into decoration. But Mara persuaded her in the quiet, indirect way people do when they have learned courage from kindness. The plaque did not describe the glass as an object of humiliation. It described it as the moment witnesses were forced to choose between silence and dignity. That wording mattered to Eleanor. It shifted the story away from what Victor had done and toward what everyone else had failed, then learned to do. Visitors often stood longest before that display. They came expecting to see legal documents, old photographs, and the famous covenant that saved the housing block. They came expecting the artifacts of a corporate scandal, yet the broken glass held them because it was ordinary. Anyone could understand it. Anyone could imagine the room. Anyone could feel the terrible smallness of being blamed in public while others watched. It reminded people that injustice rarely begins with something grand. Sometimes it begins with a laugh no one challenges, a false report no one questions, a worker no one names, a lie placed gently into official language until the truth looks rude for interrupting it. Eleanor never liked being called a hero. The word made her uncomfortable, partly because it sounded too clean, and partly because people often use heroes to avoid examining systems. If one extraordinary woman fixes everything, then ordinary people do not have to ask why they stayed silent. Eleanor preferred a harder truth. She had not been fearless. She had been frightened many times. She had delayed many years. She had doubted herself in the dark more often than anyone knew. What saved the story was not perfect bravery. It was memory, evidence, timing, and finally, enough people deciding not to look away at the same time. That was the lesson she gave whenever students visited the archive. She told them that history is not only what powerful people write down. It is also what tired workers remember after their names are removed from the wall. It is what clerks hide in storage units when they cannot stop the crime, but cannot bear to let it vanish. It is what housekeepers preserve in sealed envelopes, what young women find in locked drawers, what communities carry in photographs, songs, recipes, routes, receipts, and stories repeated at kitchen tables long after official plaques have lied. The Hayes Reed Center grew far beyond what anyone expected. At first, it was meant to be an archive and training space. Then it became a legal clinic, then a scholarship office, then a meeting place for tenants from other neighborhoods facing redevelopment, dressed up as progress. Families came with folders of notices they did not understand. Retired workers came with old pay stubs and names of people forgotten by companies that still use their labor in anniversary videos. Students came to research not only Eleanor's case, but the deeper pattern beneath it, how cities praise growth while hiding the people displaced by it. Eleanor watched all of this with a tenderness that surprised her. For most of her life, survival had narrowed her world. Rent, medicine, groceries, memory, grief. These had been the borders of her days. Now her name opened doors for others, not because she had sought fame, but because truth, once restored, can become shelter. The money from her settlement could have allowed her to leave the city, buy a quiet house near the sea, and spend her remaining years far from the place that wounded her. Some people encouraged that. They told her she deserved rest. She did deserve rest. But Eleanor understood that rest did not always mean distance. Sometimes rest means staying in the place where you were erased and no longer feeling the need to disappear. Sometimes healing means hearing children laugh in a building that was almost demolished. Sometimes peace means walking past a plaque with your name on it and knowing it is not there, because powerful people felt generous, but because they were finally forced to stop lying. Victor Langford's life continued, but smaller. That was perhaps the most fitting consequence. He had always wanted scale, bigger towers, larger deals, louder rooms, more important tables. After the scandal, his world contracted, not to poverty, not to the kind of hardship he had imposed on others, but to irrelevance among the class of people who fear shame more than wrongdoing. He still had money, but money alone could not restore the gaze he once commanded. He still had opinions, but fewer people invited him to share them. He still insisted privately that he had been betrayed by weakness, envy, and public hysteria, but the world had moved on without asking his permission. For a while, he tried to rebuild himself through interviews that never aired, lawsuits that narrowed into paperwork, and private meetings with men who once admired his ruthlessness, until ruthlessness became bad branding. The more he tried to explain, the more he revealed that he had learned nothing. He believed he had lost because people had become too sensitive. He never understood that he had lost because, for once, the people he considered background were connected to one another before he could isolate them. His punishment was not only that he fell, it was that he fell in a way that proved Eleanor's lesson. Power without humility depends on silence. Once silence breaks, it has very little else to stand on. Lily's transformation was slower and more honest because it did not end with one brave act. The world liked to describe her as the Langford who chose the truth. But Lily knew that truth had chased her for years before she stopped running. She carried guilt, and Eleanor never pretended guilt was the same as repair. Their relationship remained careful, sometimes warm, sometimes strained, always real. There were days when Lily's presence comforted Eleanor, and days when the Langford name still felt like a shadow at the edge of the room. But Lily kept showing up. She worked without asking to lead. She listened without trying to center her shame. She used her access to help uncover additional records of workers denied pensions, contractors pressured into silence, and foundation grants used to soften opposition to projects that harmed the very people they claimed to serve. Each discovery hurt her, but pain was no longer an excuse to stop. She had finally learned that inherited privilege becomes inherited responsibility the moment a person stops pretending not to know. Mara became one of the strongest voices at the center. The girl who once trembled beside the service corridor learned to stand before rooms full of workers and explain their rights with clear, steady patience. She became a lawyer years later, though Eleanor did not live quite long enough to see her first major case. But she saw enough. She saw Mara study at the archive tables late into the evening. She saw her mentor younger students from families like her own. She saw the fear leave her shoulders little by little. And every time Mara crossed the old warehouse floor with books in her arms, Eleanor remembered the night of the gala and felt something inside the memory soften. Not disappear. Soften. That is often the best healing can do. The old housing block changed, too. Renovation took years, and it was not perfect. Nothing involving courts, contractors, committees, and money ever is. There were delays, arguments, budget concerns, and residents who worried that promises could still turn into traps. Eleanor understood their skepticism. She trusted it more than easy gratitude. Trust built slowly there, brick by brick, lease by lease, repair by repair. Roofs were fixed, elevators replaced, gardens expanded. A child care room opened in the basement of one building. A wall that once carried eviction notices became covered with photographs of the neighborhood's history. The city eventually renamed the street beside the old warehouse Eleanor Hayes Way. She objected to that too, not because she lacked pride, but because she feared one name might overshadow many. The compromise came in the form of a long bronze strip embedded into the sidewalk, carrying not only her name but hundreds of others: drivers, dispatchers, cleaners, mechanics, clerks, cooks, spouses, volunteers, and residents who had built, fed, repaired, challenged, and remembered the community. Visitors walking toward the archive had to pass over those names. Children traced them with their fingers. Families found grandparents there. People cried over names the rest of the city had never known enough to forget. Eleanor liked that. A sidewalk full of names felt more honest than a statue. In her final years, Eleanor's body slowed. Her mind remained sharp, though some days tiredness came like weather. She spent fewer hours at the center, but her presence remained everywhere. in the corrected timeline on the wall, in the scholarship letters, in the legal clinic's insistence that no worker be dismissed as difficult simply for telling the truth, in the training sessions where managers were taught that respect was not a slogan for gala speeches, but a practice measured most clearly when no wealthy guest was watching. On her last visit to the archive, Eleanor asked to be taken to the room where the original covenant was displayed. Lily accompanied her, though she stayed a few steps behind. Mara was there too, now older, more confident, carrying the calm strength of someone who had turned shame into service. Reverend Mercer had passed the year before, and his photograph hung near the entrance, smiling with the same tired kindness he had carried through every fight. Mrs. Calloway's sealed envelope was displayed nearby, proof that even those forced to serve inside powerful houses can choose, quietly and bravely, to preserve what power once destroyed. Eleanor stood before the covenant for a long time. The signature still looked bold. It no longer surprised her. She had come to recognize that the boldness had always been hers, even during the years when the world made her feel small. The betrayal had not erased it. Poverty had not erased it. The uniform had not erased it. Victor's cruelty had not erased it. It had simply waited beneath the surface, like a seed under winter soil, alive in a darkness that could not last forever. Before leaving, Eleanor placed one hand lightly against the glass case. She did not speak aloud, or at least not in a way others could hear. But Lily saw her lips move and understood that the words were not meant for the crowd, or the press, or the company, or even the future. They were meant for the young woman in the photograph, the woman who had signed her name with confidence and paid dearly for trusting the wrong men. Perhaps Eleanor was telling her that they had made it home. Perhaps she was telling her that the truth had arrived late, but it had arrived carrying witnesses. Perhaps she was telling her that the years stolen from them had not been returned, but they had been redeemed into protection for others. Whatever the words were, they belonged to Eleanor, and for once, no one tried to take them. When Eleanor Hayes passed away, the city did not respond with the empty politeness often reserved for respectable old age. It responded as if a witness had left the room and everyone remaining had inherited her responsibility. The archive stayed open late that week. People came with flowers, letters, photographs, and stories. Former residents of the housing block stood beside corporate employees who had joined Langford Global after the reforms. Students read her speeches aloud. Mara placed the broken glass display beneath a small arrangement of white lilies. Lily brought the old photograph from her apartment and stood before it without crying until long after the crowd had gone. Langford Global issued a statement too. This time, it used Eleanor's full name. It acknowledged her as a founding architect of the company's expansion and the author of the Worker Participation Covenant. It admitted that her contributions had been deliberately suppressed and that the company's rise had been stained by actions taken to deny her rightful place in its history. The statement was not perfect. No corporate statement can carry the full weight of a life, but it was public. It was specific. It was permanent, and somewhere beyond the reach of all boardrooms. Perhaps that mattered. Yet Eleanor's real memorial was not the statement. It was the young tenant who kept her apartment, because the trust existed. It was the scholarship student who became a nurse. It was the former warehouse worker whose pension claim was reopened. It was the service employee who reported abuse and was believed because policies had changed. It was Mara standing in court years later, defending workers whose names powerful men had never bothered to learn. It was Lily teaching her own children that family pride means nothing if it cannot survive the truth. And it was every person who heard Eleanor's story and remembered a room where they had once stayed silent. That was the final gift of her life. Not that she made everyone brave forever. No story can do that. But she made silence harder. She made cowardice more visible. She made people understand that looking away is never neutral when someone is being humiliated in front of you. She showed that dignity is not granted by wealth, title, age, or applause. Dignity exists before anyone recognizes it. The shame belongs not to the person denied dignity, but to those who deny it and those who watch it happen without protest. Years later, when school groups visited the Hayes Reed Center, guides often ended the tour near the display of the broken glass. They would describe the gala, the accusation, the video, the documents, the fire, the covenant, the fall of Victor Langford, and the saving of the housing block. Then they would pause and ask the students to imagine the ballroom before the truth was known. Not after. Before. Before the articles. Before the evidence. Before the board meeting. Before the world praised Eleanor. Before it was safe to stand beside her. Because that was the only question that mattered. Who would you have been when she was still just an old cleaner on the floor? The answer was not meant to be spoken quickly. It was meant to follow people home. It was meant to sit beside them in offices, restaurants, classrooms, hospitals, hotels, and family gatherings. It was meant to rise in their throats the next time someone powerful mocked someone powerless. It was meant to turn memory into action before justice required decades of repair. Eleanor Hayes never wanted revenge to be her legacy. She wanted the truth to do what truth is supposed to do when it is finally freed. She wanted it to protect, to correct, to warn, to restore names, to make cruelty costly, to make silence uncomfortable, to make the next Victor Langford hesitate before mistaking a uniform for weakness and a quiet woman for an easy target. And perhaps, in the end, that is why her story endured. Not because an empire fell. Empires fall all the time, often under the weight of their own arrogance. Her story endured because one forgotten woman, carrying papers no one wanted to read and memories no one wanted to honor, reminded the world that justice does not always arrive young, loud, or dressed in power. Sometimes justice arrives old. Sometimes it arrives tired. Sometimes it arrives through a service corridor, wearing a plain black coat, holding an envelope close to its heart. Sometimes it kneels to pick up broken glass while everyone else watches. And even then, even in that moment, it is not defeated. It is only waiting. Waiting for one witness. Waiting for one key. Waiting for one document. Waiting for one person brave enough to say that the truth will not be made private again. So let Eleanor's story remain where it belongs. Not locked inside a company archive. Not softened into a polite apology. And not reduced to a scandal that passed through the news and disappeared. Let it remain in every room where dignity is tested. Let it stand beside every worker treated as invisible. Let it trouble every comfortable silence. Let it remind us that the people who build the world are often the first to be pushed out of its photographs. And let it remind us, most of all, that no one is truly powerless when the truth is still alive. A glass may shatter in a second. A lie may survive for decades. But when the right person picks up the pieces, even the sharpest fragments can catch the light. And sometimes, that light is enough to bring an empire to its knees. If this story stayed with you, remember Eleanor Hayes the next time you see someone being treated as if they do not matter. Because in that moment, the choice is not only about them, It is about who you become while everyone else is watching. The storm was loud enough to bury most sounds in Riverton that night, but Caleb Henderson still heard the motorcycle before it reached his shop.
The engine is screaming for help.
He heard the engine screaming through the rain, fighting for one more mile through Riverton's empty industrial streets.
Come on, just one more mile.
A violent metallic knock cut through the wind
Not now.
and turned Malik's last mile into a fight for control. The bike slid into the flooded lot outside Henderson Motor Works, dragged sideways by rain, failing metal, and fading control. The rider fell hard near the old garage door, soaked to the bone and clutching his shoulder beside the ruined Harley.
Sir, can you make it run long enough to get me home?
Before Caleb understood why Malik was riding through the storm, he learned Malik had promised his daughter he would be at her graduation by morning.
My daughter is waiting for me.
Malik had no money, no backup plan, and no time left to lose. All he had was a father's promise waiting at the end of the road. Caleb opened the ruined Harley with the careful hands of a man who had spent his life listening to machines. Caleb listened to the broken engine for only a few seconds and felt 18 years of buried pain rise inside him.
I know that sound.
The failure was not ordinary wear. It carried the same deliberate pattern Caleb had feared for 18 years.
I've seen this before.
The sound inside Malik's Harley had already destroyed Caleb's life once, long before this storm brought it back to his door.
What did this bike do to you?
Because that sound had already destroyed his life once. For several seconds, neither man spoke as rain tapped steadily against the garage roof.
Don't touch a thing.
For several seconds, neither man spoke. Malik stood near the workbench, staring at the old title papers, as if the ink might rearrange itself into something easier to understand. Caleb remained beside the exposed engine, one hand resting against the cold metal of the Road King. The storm had begun to move beyond Riverton by then, but rain still tapped steadily against the roof, slipping through a crack near the back wall and falling into an empty oil pan with a slow, hollow rhythm. Malik had spent most of his adult life around motorcycles. He knew enough to recognize when a mechanic was concerned and when a mechanic was simply trying to sound important. But what he saw on Caleb's face was neither. It was grief mixed with recognition, the look of a man who had just found a piece of his own past hidden inside a stranger's machine. He asked Caleb what the name on the paperwork meant. The old mechanic did not answer immediately. He picked up the damaged cam component again and turned it beneath the fluorescent light. Its edges were worn down, but the seal was still there. Small, faint, nearly invisible unless someone knew where to look. Then Caleb told Malik that the rider listed on those documents had died in the accident that ruined him. Not the man who bought the bike years later. Not the rider who had owned it before Malik. The original rider. The man whose crash had been used to blame Caleb for a failure he had tried to prevent. Malik looked back at the Road King. Suddenly, the motorcycle no longer seemed like an unlucky purchase from a liquidation yard. It looked like evidence that had somehow survived 18 years of lies. Caleb explained that the official report had claimed the motorcycle had been destroyed after the crash. That detail had always bothered him, though he had never been able to prove why. The bike had been taken away before he could inspect it. The police had refused to let him near the evidence. Victor's lawyers had moved quickly, and every question Caleb asked had been treated as the bitter complaint of a man trying to escape responsibility. By the time Caleb understood how completely he had been trapped, the machine was gone. Or so he had believed. Malik asked the question that had been hanging in the garage since the moment Caleb saw the title. If the bike was supposed to be destroyed, how had it ended up in his hands? Caleb had no answer, but he knew one thing with certainty. Machines did not disappear on their own. Someone had moved that Harley. Someone had rebuilt it. Someone had removed parts, replaced evidence, erased records, and then sent it back into the world under a different history. And if the same kind of damaged component had caused the previous owner's highway crash, then Victor Hale's secret had not ended 18 years earlier. It had continued. That realization changed the repair. Until then, Caleb had been trying to save Malik's ride so a father could keep a promise to his daughter. But now every part that came off the engine mattered for another reason. The damaged chain, the worn guide, the altered tensioner, the hidden hail seal. None of it could be thrown away. Caleb laid each piece on a clean cloth, carefully separating them from the normal debris of the repair. He took photographs with an old digital camera from a drawer beneath the counter. The camera was outdated, its screen scratched, but it still worked. He photographed the seals, the manufacturing numbers, the strange cuts in the metal, and the repair marks that had been hidden under layers of grease. Malik watched quietly for a while. Then he asked whether this could get Caleb into trouble. The old mechanic gave a tired half-smile. Trouble, he said, had been living with him for 18 years. He just had not known its name. That was the first time Malik saw something change in Caleb. Before that night, the older man had carried himself like someone trying not to take up space in the world. He moved carefully. He spoke softly. He avoided eye contact too long. But now, while studying the engine, Caleb's hands became steadier. His back straightened. The old instinct returned to him, the instinct of a mechanic who trusted what he knew, even when nobody else believed him. He began explaining the failure in a way Malik could understand. The chain tensioner had not simply worn down. It had been weakened by design. The materials were cheap, but the failure pattern was too consistent to be accidental. The part had been made to look almost identical to a reliable one, yet it lacked the strength required for long-distance riding. It would survive just long enough to pass inspection. It would survive long enough for a customer to drive away feeling satisfied. Then, under heat and pressure, it would begin to fail. A rider might hear a faint metallic tapping first, then a vibration. Then, if they ignored it or could not reach help in time, the engine could lock. Caleb's voice became quieter as he described the last part. An engine lock at highway speed could turn a motorcycle into a weapon against the person riding it. Malik looked down at the wet leather gloves in his hands. He had been less than an hour from that kind of disaster when he reached Henderson Motor Works. For the first time, he understood that Caleb had not just repaired his bike. The old man may have saved his life. But Caleb did not want gratitude. He seemed almost uncomfortable when Malik tried to thank him. Instead, he returned to the engine and kept working. Every few minutes, he would pause, listen, adjust something, and continue. There was no rush in his movements, yet there was urgency in everything he did. The clock above the office door passed 2 in the morning, then 3. By 4, the rain had weakened into a mist, and the distant thunder had faded beyond the warehouses at the edge of town. The city outside had gone quiet. Only the occasional sound of tires on wet pavement passed through the darkness. Inside the garage, Caleb installed the camshaft he had kept hidden for so many years. He did not make a ceremony of it. He did not tell Malik how much it had cost him to use it. He simply cleaned the part one final time, fitted it into place, and tightened each bolt with the kind of attention that comes from experience and regret. But Malik understood. He had seen the way Caleb held that camshaft before putting it into the engine. It was not like a mechanic holding a spare part. It was like a father holding the last object connected to a life he had failed to protect. Malik offered to pay for it. Caleb refused. Malik offered to sell the Road King once he reached Fairmont, to send the money back, to do whatever it took. Again, Caleb refused. Then, after a long silence, the old man told him something that did not sound like an order. It sounded more like a request from someone who had spent too many years alone. He asked Malik to come back after the graduation. No matter what happened, no matter how tired he was, no matter whether the day went well or badly. Just come back. Malik nodded. He had no idea why that promise mattered so much, but he knew it did. And after hearing what Caleb had lost, he could not bring himself to take the request lightly. A little before dawn, the Road King came back to life. The engine did not roar wildly. It settled into a deep, steady rhythm, low and strong, like a heartbeat returning after a long illness. Caleb listened with his head slightly tilted, eyes closed, letting the sound fill the garage. For a moment, Malik thought the old mechanic might cry, but Caleb only opened his eyes and gave a single nod. The bike was ready. Malik stood beside it in the gray light of early morning, looking down at the man who had worked through a storm for someone he had never met. He wanted to say something meaningful, something big enough to match what had been done for him. But there are moments when words feel too small. So he simply told Caleb that he would not forget. Caleb looked toward the old framed photograph in the office. Then he looked back at Malik. He told him that forgetting was easy. Keeping a promise was harder. Malik rode out of Riverton as the first thin line of sunlight touched the clouds. The streets were still wet. The warehouses were still dark. But the Road King moved smoothly beneath him, carrying him toward Fairmont, toward his daughter, toward the promise he had nearly lost. Caleb remained at the garage door long after the sound of the motorcycle disappeared. Then he turned back inside. The broken parts were still laid out on the cloth. The old title papers were still open on the workbench. The Hale seal sat beneath the yellow light like a small wound that had finally started bleeding again. Caleb picked up the burned spark plug he had kept from Isaiah's accident. For 18 years, he had treated it like proof of his failure. He had hidden it in a drawer, taken it out only when grief became too heavy, then put it away again before morning. But that day, he did not return it to the drawer. He placed it beside the damaged component from Malik's motorcycle. Old evidence beside new evidence. A dead son beside a living truth. By 8 o'clock, Riverton was awake. And by 9, Victor Hale was standing outside Henderson Motor Works with 2 investors, a polished black SUV, and the kind of smile that had fooled people for most of his life. Victor had aged well on the surface. His hair was silver now, but styled carefully. His jacket looked expensive. His watch caught the morning light. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the world had already decided he was important. Behind him, across the street, banners were being hung on a vacant lot. The banners displayed the logo of Hale Performance Customs and announced the opening of a new luxury performance center. It was bigger than Victor's original garage had ever been. Glass walls, chrome signage, a showroom for wealthy riders who wanted their machines to look dangerous without ever having to understand what was inside them. Caleb watched from the doorway as Victor approached. The investors stayed a few steps behind, pretending to admire the old shop while clearly seeing it as nothing more than a piece of land in the way. Victor greeted Caleb with the practiced warmth of a man who enjoyed being cruel only when no one could prove it. He spoke about progress, about opportunity, about how Riverton was changing. Then he handed Caleb a folder containing the final notice from the bank. 7 days. That was all Caleb had left before the property would be transferred. Victor acted as though he was doing him a favor by delivering the news personally. He suggested that perhaps it was time for Caleb to stop fighting old ghosts. He suggested that a man his age deserved peace. Caleb did not react. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked back to the workbench and picked up the damaged component from Malik's bike. Then he placed it on the counter between them. Victor's expression changed, only for a second. But Caleb saw it. The smile remained, yet something behind it slipped. His eyes moved to the Hale seal stamped into the metal. His fingers tightened around the folder. The smooth confidence in his face became strained, like a thin layer of paint cracking over rust. Victor recovered quickly. He said the seal meant nothing. He claimed parts changed hands all the time. He suggested Caleb was seeing conspiracies because he could not accept the past. But when Victor turned to leave, Caleb noticed something else. His hand was trembling. Not much, just enough. And for the first time in 18 years, Caleb Henderson understood that Victor Hale was afraid. Victor Hale left Henderson Motor Works with the same polished smile he had arrived with, but Caleb knew that smile had changed. It no longer belonged to a man who felt untouchable. It belonged to a man who had just seen a ghost rise from the floorboards of his own past. For the rest of that day, Caleb did not open the shop to customers. He locked the front door, pulled down the faded blinds, and spread every piece of evidence across the workbench. Malik's damaged parts sat beside the burned spark plug from Isaiah's accident. The title papers remained open near Caleb's camera. The old evidence seemed almost impossible to connect at first. One motorcycle from 18 years ago, one bike that should have been destroyed, one seal hidden inside a part no ordinary rider would ever inspect. But Caleb had spent his life listening to engines. He knew that machines told the truth slowly. They did not care who owned the building, who signed the checks, or who had the better lawyer. Metal remembered pressure. Bearings remembered heat. Chains remembered strain. And when something failed by design, the evidence often stayed buried inside the damage. By noon, Caleb had photographed every detail twice. He wrote down serial numbers. He matched worn patterns. He checked the old manuals he had kept in a cabinet near the back wall. Then he found something he had not expected. The part inside Malik's road. King carried a batch number that had been discontinued years earlier. It was from the same supplier Victor had used before the old accident. The same supplier Caleb had warned him about. The same supplier Victor had once claimed had never existed. For nearly 2 hours, Caleb sat alone in the office, staring at that number. He could still hear Isaiah's voice in his mind, not the voice from the night he died. Caleb had tried for years not to remember that night. What stayed with him was an earlier memory. Isaiah standing beside him at the old shop, grease on his hands, laughing at the way his father could recognize a bad engine by sound alone. Isaiah had once told him that engines were honest because they could not lie about pain. If something was wrong inside them, they would always make a noise eventually. Caleb had not understood then how much those words would haunt him. Now they felt like a warning. By late afternoon, Malik called. He had made it to Fairmont. For a moment, Caleb did not answer. He stared at the phone, still unsure whether the call would bring relief or more trouble. Then he picked up. Malik's voice was tired, but it carried something Caleb had not heard in years. Joy. He had arrived just before the ceremony began. He had walked into the school auditorium with rain still drying on his jacket and road dust on his boots. His daughter had been seated among the graduates, wearing the dress he had carried through the storm. When she saw him, she did not run to him. She did not make a scene. She simply looked over the crowd, found him standing near the back wall, and smiled in a way that made every mile worth it. Malik told Caleb that he had never felt so ashamed of how close he came to breaking that promise. Then he told him that his daughter had hugged him afterward and said she knew he would come. That was all Caleb needed to hear. For the first time in 18 years, he felt that maybe one promise had been saved from the same fate as all the others. But Malik had not forgotten what happened at the shop. He had spent part of the afternoon searching through the paperwork for his Road King. The more he looked, the stranger it became. The title history had gaps. The previous owner had purchased the bike through a dealer that no longer existed. The dealer's address turned out to belong to a storage company connected to Hale Performance Customs, and the insurance report from the old owner's death mentioned a mechanical failure but did not list the exact cause. That detail bothered Malik. He called one of the men from Road Saints MC, an older biker named Curtis Bell. Curtis had spent more than 20 years as a state traffic investigator before retirement. He knew how evidence disappeared when powerful people wanted it gone. He also knew how often old files were marked closed long before the truth was fully understood. Malik told him everything. At first, Curtis was cautious. He had seen too many people mistake grief for proof. But when Malik mentioned the Hale seal and the batch number, Curtis became quiet. Then he told Malik that he had heard rumors years ago about Hale Performance Customs. Rumors of cheap parts, suspicious accidents, customers pressured into silence, and repair records that never quite matched the machines on the road. Nothing had ever been proven. Not because there was no truth, because no one had managed to hold enough of it at once. Malik told Curtis he had found a man who might have been carrying part of that truth for 18 years. 3 days later, Malik returned to Riverton. He did not come alone. By then, Caleb had almost convinced himself that Malik would not return. He had spent the days preparing for the bank's deadline, sorting tools into boxes, deciding which machines he could sell, which photographs he could not bear to throw away, and which memories he would have to leave behind if Henderson Motor Works closed forever. He had also started to notice cars slowing near the shop. A black sedan passed twice one afternoon. A dark pickup sat across the street for nearly an hour. Nothing happened. No threats, no broken windows, no warning left on the door. But Caleb understood the message. Victor was watching. On the fourth morning after the storm, the sound of motorcycles rolled down the street. Not one bike, several. The sound was deep and steady, echoing through Riverton's old warehouse district. Caleb stepped outside and saw Malik leading a line of riders into the parking lot. Behind him were members of Road Saints MC, all of them dressed in worn leather and rain-faded denim. They did not arrive like men looking for trouble. They arrived like people who had already decided that someone had been left alone for too long. Curtis Bell was among them. He was tall, gray-haired, and walked with the stiff posture of a man whose old injuries had never fully healed. Beside him stood another biker Caleb recognized after a long moment. The man's name was Raymond Knox, a retired Harley mechanic who had who had once worked at a supplier near Hale's original garage. Raymond looked older than Caleb remembered. His face had deep lines, and his hands shook slightly as he removed his gloves. But his eyes were clear. He told Caleb he had been at Hale Performance Customs on the night of the accident. Caleb did not speak. Raymond explained that he had delivered a crate of parts that evening. He had seen Victor argue with Caleb near the service bay. He had heard Caleb warn him that the cam system was dangerous. He had heard Victor say the bike was leaving that night, no matter what Caleb thought. Then, after the crash, Raymond saw Victor pull paperwork from an office drawer before the police arrived. He watched him hand documents to a lawyer. He watched him tell everyone that Caleb had approved the work. Raymond had wanted to say something then, but Victor had threatened him. Not openly. Not in a way that could be reported. Victor had simply made it clear that Raymond's job, his reputation, and his family's security could disappear if he caused trouble. Raymond had been younger then. His wife was sick. His son had just started college. He convinced himself that someone else would speak up. No one did. For 18 years, he had carried that cowardice. When Malik told him about Caleb repairing the Road King through the storm, using his own last valuable part to help a stranger keep a promise to his daughter, Raymond said something inside him changed. He realized Caleb had spent 18 years paying for a sin that belonged to another man. And Raymond had spent 18 years helping that lie survive. Curtis placed a thick folder on Caleb's workbench. Inside were copies of old reports, insurance records, auction documents, and storage transfers. It took hours to piece together the full story, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. The motorcycle from the original accident had not been destroyed. It had been moved from the evidence yard under a false disposal order. A shell company had purchased it. The shell company was linked through a chain of ownership to Hale Performance Customs. The bike was rebuilt using replacement parts, then sold through another intermediary to avoid attention. Years later, it reappeared in the hands of the man whose name Malik had found on the title. That man died in a highway accident after his engine locked. The Road King was later sold again through an estate liquidation. And eventually, by chance or fate, it made its way to Malik. The machine had carried the same secret through several owners, leaving wreckage behind it like a trail no one had bothered to follow. Caleb sat down slowly. He had spent years believing the past was over because everyone else had moved on. But the truth was worse. Victor had not simply destroyed Caleb's life and walked away. He had taken the same dangerous system, the same dishonest parts, the same method of hiding evidence, and turned it into a business model. The old accident was not one tragedy. It was the first warning. Curtis told Caleb they needed independent engineers. They needed the damaged parts examined by people with no connection to Hale. They needed the old case reopened. They needed journalists willing to listen. And they needed to move before Victor had time to erase anything else. Caleb listened, but fear still lived inside him. He had been here before. He had brought concerns to people in authority. He had trusted that facts would matter. He had watched Victor walk away while his own name was dragged through the mud. Malik understood that fear, so he did not pressure Caleb. He simply told him that some men spend their whole lives waiting for the right moment to become brave, only to learn that bravery usually begins when someone else is already in danger. That sentence stayed with Caleb. The next morning, Victor Hale announced the grand opening of his newest performance center. It was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, directly across from Henderson Motor Works. The timing was not accidental. Victor wanted cameras, investors, local officials, and reporters to see his polished new showroom, while Caleb's fading garage stood behind it like a symbol of failure. He wanted Riverton to believe that the future belonged to him, and that men like Caleb were nothing more than rusted pieces of the past. The invitation described Hale Performance Customs as a company built on safety, craftsmanship, and loyalty. When Caleb read those words, he almost laughed. Instead, he folded the paper and placed it beside Isaiah's burned spark plug. By Saturday, the street outside Henderson Motor Works looked nothing like it had during the storm. The skies were clear. The sidewalks had been washed clean. White tents stood outside Victor's new building. Caterers moved between tables. Large banners carried the Hale logo. Investors in tailored jackets gathered near the entrance, speaking about growth, property values, and expansion. Victor stood near the stage in front of the showroom doors, smiling for photographs. For years, he had mastered the art of looking like a man who had earned everything. Across the street, Caleb's old sign hung crooked above the garage. Henderson Motor Works. The letters were faded. The roof still leaked. The windows still needed paint. But that morning, the shop was not empty. Inside, Curtis reviewed the evidence one final time. Raymond sat near the office door, pale but determined. Malik stood beside the Road King, now fully repaired. His daughter's graduation flower still tucked into a side compartment. Several members of Road Saints MC waited outside, engines quiet, helmets in hand. Caleb stood near the workbench. In front of him was a small metal box. Inside were the damaged Hale parts, the old spark plug, photographs, records, and copies of every document that could prove what Victor had done. His hands were trembling, not because he doubted the evidence, because he knew that once he stepped outside, there would be no going back. For 18 years, Victor Hale had controlled the story. He had told Riverton who Caleb was. He had told the police what happened. He had told the newspapers who was responsible. And Caleb had lived inside that lie because he had no power to break it. But now, standing in the quiet shop with Malik, Curtis, Raymond, and the Road Saints behind him, Caleb realized something he had forgotten. Truth did not need to be loud to be strong. It only needed enough people willing to stop looking away. At noon, Victor stepped onto the stage. He began with the same speech he had given at other openings. He spoke about American craftsmanship. He praised the spirit of the open road. He thanked the investors who believed in his vision. He spoke about trust, safety, and the brotherhood of riders. Then the sound of motorcycles filled the street. One by one, the Road Saints rode into view. More than 30 Harleys moved down the block in a slow line, their engines low and controlled. They did not rev aggressively. They did not block traffic recklessly. They did not shout. They simply arrived. The crowd turned. Victor's smile stiffened. Malik led the group on the blue-black Road King that Caleb had repaired in the storm. He parked directly across from the stage. Behind him, the other riders formed a straight row along the curb. Then Caleb stepped out of Henderson Motor Works. He wore the same faded work shirt he had worn for years. His hands were still stained with oil. His shoulders were slightly bent with age. But he did not look small. He carried the metal box under one arm. Curtis walked beside him holding the records. Raymond followed behind, moving slowly but refusing to stop. The local reporter who had come to cover Victor's opening recognized Caleb almost immediately. She remembered the old accident. She remembered the headlines from 18 years ago. She also remembered that Caleb had disappeared from public life after Isaiah died. When she asked what was happening, Curtis handed her a copy of the evidence summary. The mood changed quickly. Victor tried to interrupt. He told everyone that Caleb was confused. He suggested that the old mechanic was bitter and unstable. He said the Road Saints were trying to sabotage a legitimate business. But his voice no longer carried the same confidence. Too many people were watching. And this time, Caleb was not alone. Curtis explained the chain of evidence, the false disposal order, the shell company, the rebuilt motorcycle, the repeat failure pattern, the supplier records, the mismatched parts, the mechanics analysis, the old accident report that never mentioned the batch number. Raymond then spoke. His voice shook at first, but it grew steadier with every sentence. He told the crowd that Caleb had warned Victor. He confirmed that Victor had pushed the unsafe bike out of the shop. He described the paperwork being changed before investigators arrived. He admitted that he had stayed silent because he was afraid. He said he had been ashamed of that silence every day since. The crowd did not move. Victor looked toward the investors, hoping they would dismiss it all as drama. But they had stopped smiling. One of them was already on the phone. Another stared at the Hale banner above the showroom entrance as if it had become something ugly. Then Caleb opened the metal box. He removed the burned spark plug. For a moment, the entire street seemed to grow quieter. Caleb told them it came from the motorcycle involved in the crash 18 years earlier. He explained that he had kept it because he believed it represented his failure. But after studying Malik's Road King, he understood that the machine had been failing long before Isaiah died. He held up the damaged Hale component. Then he looked directly at Victor. Caleb did not scream. He did not curse. He did not beg anyone to believe him. He simply told Victor that he had taken his name, his work, and his son. But he had never understood the machines he sold. That was the moment Victor finally lost control. He accused Caleb of lying. He called Raymond a coward and Curtis a washed-up investigator. He claimed Malik had planted evidence. He insisted that the old accident had been closed for years and that no one could reopen it. But panic made him careless. The reporter asked why he knew the old case had been listed as destroyed if he had never seen the disposal order. Victor froze. It was only a brief pause, but it was enough. Curtis had already contacted the State Fraud Division. The reporter had already sent copies of the documents to her editor. Independent engineers had reviewed Caleb's photographs and confirmed that the part failures were consistent with deliberate use of substandard materials. Within an hour, law enforcement officers arrived. They did not arrest Victor immediately in front of everyone. First, they secured the damaged motorcycle parts. They collected the records. They questioned Raymond. They requested access to Hale Performance Customs files, supplier contracts, repair logs, and storage records. But Victor understood what was happening. The story he had buried for 18 years was no longer buried. By evening, the grand opening had been canceled. The investors withdrew. The showroom doors remained closed. And the Hale banners, once meant to celebrate Victor's success, hung over an empty parking lot like reminders of a lie too large to hide. The investigation lasted months. During that time, more writers came forward. A widow from another county brought records from her husband's crash. A former employee described being told to replace expensive parts with cheaper ones. A supplier admitted that Hale had purchased batches of components that failed safety standards but cost almost half as much. The evidence grew. So did the truth. Victor Hale was eventually charged with fraud, evidence tampering, falsifying repair records, and reckless endangerment connected to multiple motorcycle failures. Civil lawsuits followed. His business collapsed. The same reputation he had built by stealing Caleb's work became the thing that destroyed him. And the most painful part for Victor was that he could not blame anyone else. Every false signature, every altered record, every unsafe part, every rider placed at risk. All of it led back to him. Meanwhile, Riverton began to see Caleb differently. At first, people came to Henderson Motor Works out of curiosity. They wanted to see the mechanic from the news. They wanted to ask questions about the old case. Some came with apologies they should have offered years earlier. Caleb accepted some. Others he could not. Forgiveness, he learned, was not the same as pretending nothing happened. What mattered most was that Isaiah's name was cleared. The revised investigation confirmed that Isaiah had not caused the tragedy. He had tried to save others when the fire broke out. The city recognized him for his courage. A small memorial was placed near the site of the old accident, not as a monument to loss, but as proof that he had been brave when others were afraid. Caleb attended the dedication quietly. He did not give a speech. He stood beneath Isaiah's name and placed the burned spark plug at the base of the memorial for a few seconds before taking it back. This time, he did not see it as evidence of failure. He saw it as the beginning of the truth. Road Saints, MC, started a fundraiser to help Caleb keep his shop. He resisted at first. He did not want charity. He had spent too long believing that accepting help meant admitting weakness. But Malik reminded him that loyalty was not charity. Loyalty meant showing up when someone had spent years showing up for others. The money was enough to pay the bank, repair the roof, replace the failing electrical system, and repaint the front of Henderson Motor Works. Caleb refused to turn the place into something fancy. He did not want glass walls or polished chrome floors. He wanted the shop to remain what it had always been, a place where honest work mattered more than appearances. A few weeks later, a new sign went up above the garage. Henderson Motor Works, built with truth, kept alive by loyalty. Malik came by every weekend after that. Sometimes he needed a repair. Sometimes he did not. Sometimes he simply sat on an old stool near the workbench while Caleb worked and talked about his daughter's new plans after graduation. She visited once too. She brought Caleb a framed photograph from the ceremony. In it, Malik stood in the back of the auditorium, soaked jacket, tired eyes, and a smile so wide it looked almost painful. She told Caleb that her father had made a promise and kept it. Caleb looked at the picture for a long time. Then he told her that promises were not always about being perfect. Sometimes they were about refusing to stop trying, even when the road was dark, the weather was cruel, and every reason to turn back was waiting behind you. Years earlier, Caleb had lost his son because he believed work had to come before everything else. That night in the storm, he chose differently. He chose to save a stranger's promise. And in doing so, he found the truth that finally brought his own son home. Because sometimes, the person who arrives at your door needing help is not there by accident. Sometimes they carry the missing piece of a story you thought was over. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the force that pulls years of darkness into the light. And sometimes, justice does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in the sound of an old engine finally running the way it was always meant to run. If you believe that truth may take time, but it never stops searching for a way back, share this story with someone who needs to hear it.